Today's meeting of the London Assembly Transport Committee here at the Fire Brigade Head Office, our temporary base. Let's kick off. Can I welcome everyone here today, and can we make sure everyone's electronic devices are turned to silent or off, please, not vibrate, because that often picks up on the microphones. I now have to ask our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if we have any apologies for absence. I think I know the answer to that.
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence.
Lovely. We have full attendance today, so thank you very much. Let's get through the formal business before we go into our hearing. So item 2, declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2? And do members have any other item of interest they wish to declare? No. Is that noted, members? Thank you very much. Item 3, minutes. Can we confirm the minutes of the Transport Committee meeting held on the 16th of November 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you very much indeed. Summary list of actions. Item 4, can we note the ongoing and completed actions arising from the previous meeting of the committee and the additional correspondence received? Thank you. We're now going to move on to our main item, which is looking at Vision Zero, progress on outcomes. I'm just going to say to everyone, I've been around to talk to everyone, that we're going to wear our masks throughout the meeting unless you're actually speaking to give evidence or to ask questions, if you're comfortable, just given the variant and given the new guidance. I think we've got one guest who has a condition so isn't able to wear a mask. But the guidance is very clear in indoor spaces, and that would include anyone who's in the audience today as well. So just to be very clear on that, given we have to operate in person, we need to be safe. So I'm really excited. We've got a huge panel today. We're still waiting for 2 of our guests to come. We've got one person who's going to join us remotely, but in the I can't call it a chamber. In the room we're in today, we've got Jeremy Leach, Chair of London Living Streets and Action Vision Zero. Welcome, Jeremy. Thank you for coming along. Nick, we're waiting for. We've got Tom, who is, I'm looking at your name, Tom Bogdanowicz, Senior Policy and Development Officer at London Cycling Campaign. I always see it written down. I've never had to pronounce it before, Tom. Welcome along today. Neil Liversidge, who is the Chair of the Motorcycle Action Group. Welcome, Neil. Zoe's not here yet. Alan Clarke, who's the Senior Director of Policy in Northern Europe for Lime e-scooters. Welcome along, Alan. Lorraine Robertson, a former bus driver, is here with us today. Thank you, Lorraine. And John Murphy, Regional Officer Unite, has asked to join just 5 minutes ago on Zoom. So we're just getting that set up. So hopefully he will pop up on the screen in front at some point. So, and he'll be on the screen behind. And we're still waiting for Nick Simons. Oh, there he is, as if by magic. Hello, John. Welcome. Lovely. So we're still waiting for Chief Executive RoadPeace and Zoe from RNIB. So they hopefully will join us at some point. Just to remind people to turn on your microphones, you press the this visual here on your microphone and it will turn red, and just press it again to turn it off after you have spoken. So I'm going to kick off with a general opening question to everyone. I'm going to go to Jeremy first, just because he's right in front of me. And it's, how successful do you think Vision Zero has been to date?
I think the approach. Thank you, Chair. I think the approach that TfL have taken over the last 3 years and from 2016 has been a real success. I think the plan that's emerged is certainly UK leading, and I feel it's potentially for a significant city global leading. I think that there's been some fantastic successes, say around bus safety standard and the reduction in casualties there. I think that there are a number of areas where there are opportunities. I think this is the right time to review the programme, the Vision Zero Action Plan, owing significantly to the pandemic, but also because of the changes that have happened in the 3 years since it was launched. But I do think that there has been a great deal of success, and certainly compared with other UK cities, casualties have fallen at a significantly greater rate than those. But I think there are some areas of opportunity, and obviously we'll talk about this more at more length. But I think they probably you know, they revolve around the opportunities around working vehicles, removing through traffic on neighbourhood streets, encouraging the boroughs to go and enabling the boroughs, the remaining boroughs to go 20 mile an hour and move to a 20 mile an hour city, and bring in a wider agenda. I think what's really great about this version of the Vision Zero Action Plan, the Progress Report, is it does tie into other agendas such as climate change, air pollution. It's much broader, but I think there are opportunities for the indicators to be slightly broader rather than just focus on killed and seriously injured. So I think that one of the most important things that again is a move on is the idea of the real importance of reducing traffic volumes. So the safer systems on its own is a really good strategy, but I think that TfL have recognised the need to deliver lower traffic volumes, but there's got to be political will to help that, and we would say that it needs smart road user pricing sooner rather than later. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to get into the detail of some of those things you were listing out there as we go through this morning. Tom, can I come to you next? How successful do you think it's been?
Well, judging by my ride in, I used to ride around the corner about 10 years ago. It's become much more pleasant to ride in. I've either got cycle lanes or reduced traffic pretty much the whole way from North London to here. So that's very good to see. So we strongly welcome Vision Zero as an aim. And we think that it's not only about tragedy for the individuals involved, but also about transport choice. The key reason why people choose not to cycle or not to walk is because they feel unsafe, in the same way that people choose not to use public transport if they fear COVID. So that is a key step that we have to push. And we can increase the levels of cycling and walking. No reason why we shouldn't be at Dutch levels. You know, they're at around 25% of all trips. We're at 2.5% in the case of cycling, obviously much more in the case of walking. In Holland, it's 25% cycling. And what we've seen in terms of Vision Zero has been progress, but the trouble is that some of it's patchy and we're not moving fast enough. So there are a whole range of things which could be done right across the board and only in sort of silos or uneven. So we had 100 kilometres, according to TfL, of cycle route introduced in 2020. But previously, the rate was at least less than half that. And we're in danger of heading back to that sort of level. You know, we've got 20 miles an hour in 18 boroughs, but not in 15 other boroughs. We've got ISA planned for all the buses, but not necessarily for all the HGVs. We've got automatic emergency braking for motor vehicles, but it's not being introduced for HGVs, and I know it's available. So we need uptake of all of these things. Something like Safer Urban Driving, an excellent program for HGV drivers, giving them practical experience of cycling as well as an understanding of how cyclists move. That's available for HGVs, but not for bus drivers. We've got 43 junctions treated, but then the latest plans say that the next 30 junctions are not going to be treated unless the funding comes through. LCC has just identified 22 junctions which are in urgent need of attention. It carries on. Fatigue management for bus drivers, yes, but for delivery drivers, no. Camera enforcement of yellow boxes, but not keep clear signs. I mean, a problem like that is, you think it's a detail, but there's a junction in Islington where you get 1,500 cyclists per hour, and then they're blocked by a single lorry just standing across the keep clear sign. And that really does, endanger people. And one of the biggest ones from our perspective is the approach to procurement. Again, this is something that doesn't necessarily mean a cost for the individual boroughs or the highway authorities, but can be very positive. So Transport for London has, in its procurement terms, measures like CLOCS, the Construction Logistics and Community Safety Standard, FORS, the Fleet Operators Standard, Safer Urban Driving, DVS, Direct Vision Standard for lorries. All these things are standard in TfL procurement, but they're not standard in the boroughs. And if they were standard in the boroughs, we'd suddenly be heading in the right direction right across the board. And that's what we need to achieve in London. So I think more of these measures and faster.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed. Let's come to, actually, why don't I go to John online? Welcome, John. Have you got any just overall, I mean, we're going to get into some of the detail, but how successful, from your point of view, as Vision Zero has been?
I think, good morning, everyone. I think most importantly, look, there's statistics, and it's very hard to ignore them, but I think there's substantial progress still to be made, and the previous speakers alluded to more specific points. My area of, for want of a better word, expertise is very much with London buses. So I think there's some of the things that, from TfL, there seems to be a view that sometimes there's a mechanical approach to all of these sort of things, where really there can be some more immediate low-hanging fruit gains by looking at the fact that buses are operated by human beings and they have to be treated accordingly. So there's not always a mechanical fix. The previous spoke about fatigue and things like there's been the Loughborough report into the fatigue amongst London bus drivers. I think there's areas in there that can be picked up to move this along. But if we're talking about where we are at the moment, well, there's clearly been progress, but from our perspective, there's more substantial progress to be made going forward if we was to look at the more root elements of what the causes are. I'll stop there, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We will be making sure you bring you in, but also please wave at me, because I can see you when others probably, I'm not sure if you're always on the screen. Wave at me if you've got points you want to come in on. Something about Garrett, you said you had a tiny point you wanted to raise here? Okay, and
Specifically picking up what Tom was talking about, actually, about quantity of cycle lane. And I suppose my question was, as someone who cycles a lot, I've seen, as I'm sure you have, things that are called cycle lanes but are not really fit for the name. So I wonder what your view is of how we make sure that stuff that is counted, like you mentioned 100 kilometres of cycle lane, how much of that is really usable and how much of it is, you know, bits of paint that have then got cars parked in it? And how do we make sure that if it's supposed to be there doing a job to enable people to cycle, it actually is doing that and not just being a sort of tokenistic gesture?
A very good point. I like to think that the recent lanes that have been introduced do meet the standards. We are now fortunate in having standards which are described by the Department for Transport and by TfL. So there's a Department for Transport note called LTN, not those LTNs, Local Transport Note 120, which specifies what the minimum standard should be. And then there's a corresponding TfL note, I think it's the TfL Quality Route Standard, which must be adopted. And they grade the particular routes, and there's such a thing as a critical failure. And if there's a critical failure on a route, then in a design, then it simply shouldn't be adopted. So we simply shouldn't be getting to a situation where a junction, and junctions are key, is redesigned and critical failures are left in. So we had that terrible collision at Hogan, Marta Krawiec. I remember personally being on television saying 8 years ago, saying, look, this junction has to be addressed. The judge in the case of the person who was killed there before said exactly the same thing. And nothing was done for 8 years. Fortunately, this time round, somebody has addressed it, and it has been addressed almost immediately. That's what we need to be doing. We need to be moving much more quickly, and we need to be sticking to the standards, exactly as you said. So I wholly agree with you.
But specifically, you think the standards are being adhered to? You know, the classic problem of a wide straight road, you paint in a cycle lane where it's not really needed, then you get to a narrow bit or a junction, it becomes difficult and it just gives up. Are we still seeing that problem?
Yes, and I think no infrastructure should be delivered unless it's been approved and it meets the standards. I mean, that is the way forward. I mean, we do still see, I saw some photos and videos yesterday of cycle lanes which dodge on and off the pavement. I mean, don't be ridiculous. That sort of thing just should not happen. I know TfL has a limited number of officers to police this sort of thing, but that is how it has to happen. Either the borough needs to make sure that it meets the standards, or TfL needs to be checking the standards. And, you know, they're out there. The authority responsible for introducing low standard infrastructure is ultimately responsible. If somebody is then involved in a collision, they can have reason to complain.
Okay, lovely. Lorraine, do you want to come in on the main question about how successful, from your point of view as a bus driver, the Vision Zero has been to date? Do you want to press the microphone? Yeah, well done. Lovely.
First of all, I'd like to say how grateful I am for the opportunity to speak at the committee today on behalf of other London bus drivers and also transport workers. I've only just left work last week. Basically, I retired and I'm tired. I've spoken to a lot of colleagues and we don't think Vision Zero has been taken into consideration where the bus drivers are concerned. The companies, TfL, Sadiq Khan, the mayor, we're under the impression that it doesn't apply to us. We never, ever hear anything about it. When I first heard about Vision Zero, I had to actually look it up because it's never spoken about. We never have any meetings. Our union reps don't talk about it at all. And in the last year, we've had 50 deaths due to bus accidents or incidents, as we have to call them. That's 50 too many. We don't get up in the morning and say, we're going to have an accident today and we're going to kill somebody or we're going to hurt somebody, or even an accident on our bus where we've had to brake sharply and somebody's fallen and hurt themselves. Vision Zero, I and my colleagues personally feel it's not taken into consideration for political gain. It doesn't serve TfL or the mayor to change how we drive out. I mean, we're professional drivers and we all do take pride in driving our buses. I just don't think enough is put into place. We're not trained enough. We don't speak about Vision Zero. We know about bikes. We know we have to be aware of them jumping on and off pavements and going through red traffic lights. That's as far as our training goes, and that's us ourselves. That's nothing to do with the company's TfL. We just don't want to hurt anybody. So at the end of the day, I mean, they talk, John Murphy, our union rep, the regional officer, spoke about the fatigue very briefly. The fatigue has been shelved. Since the pandemic, we haven't heard about the fatigue. We are tired. Us bus drivers, and especially through the pandemic, we covered shifts because half of our drivers were either furloughed or COVID, and we lost 70 bus drivers, higher than the national average. We covered that. Nobody spoke to us about Vision Zero and fatigue. We're just bus drivers. Like we don't matter.
That's really helpful, thank you. We're kind of getting some of that detail later. That's really helpful that from your point of view it's not reached buses. Let's bring in our final guest on this opening question. Neil, what's your view on this? Put your mic on, please, thanks.
Okay, I've not had a lot of involvement with Vision Zero in London, but I've been involved with this on an international level for more than 20 years now, from its origination in Sweden. And whilst I think it's absolutely fine in theory, I think if it's pursued dogmatically to the exclusion of all else, it's bound to fail, because there is a certain element of danger in life which you can't get away from. And it's multifaceted. Just listening to what Lorraine said just now, I completely empathise with what she said. My own mother was knocked down and killed by a bus 31st of July 2007. And this is not meant to be a harsh statement in relation to my mother, but it was her fault. And I went to the inquest, I heard all the expert evidence, I heard the evidence that the lady bus driver gave. And when the coroner, the West Yorkshire coroner at the time, asked me for my input, I stated my honest view then, and it's the same now, which was that the lady bus driver concerned was not to blame. My mother was 83 and she'd lost all hazard perception, and she literally walked out into the side of a bus that was swinging round in a right turn, and the lady bus driver was looking to her left front because the overhang on the bus means that it's in danger of encroaching on the pavement where people stand right up to the curb edge. So I think it's a completely wrong thing to assume that every time a pedestrian or a cyclist or even a motorcyclist is killed, somebody else has to be at some kind of criminal fault. There are elements of life, this is the way life is, that people sometimes do silly things, reckless things and thoughtless things which result in harm to themselves. I've done it myself in a motoring context and in a home context. And, you know, whereas there are some people around this table who I know are not going to want to hear this, I speak about the world as I find it and as I experience it, and not according to any political dogma.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to move through most of my questions, and then I'll bring in Assembly Member Garrett. So, really, I think these are aimed at you, Jeremy. What do you think are the main challenges to achieving the targets set out in the action plan?
Thank you. I think we think they sort of fall into, well, a number of categories, but three main ones for now. I think, first of all, progress has been good for vehicle occupants. I think there's, you know, we look at the 2022 target of 65% reduction from the 2005 to 9 baseline, essentially all vehicle occupants, that is falling at, you know, around 2/3. Up until 2019, there were significant problems in relation to pedestrians, motorcycling casualties, and in particular cycling casualties. So the good news on that is the rate of casualty had fallen, but not to the level required. So I think you know, what are often termed vulnerable users remain a real source of concern, and the plan needs to particularly focus on them. I think there's a real danger in the recovery from the pandemic and on the long-term pressure of funding for public transport. There's a real danger that we're going to miss the Mayor's transport strategy targets. And I think, you know, London Cycling Campaign in its work has said that, you know, we need to go much further than that. We need to go down to around 10% motor vehicle journeys in London. So, you know, I think in the context of the climate emergencies, there's a real job to do, and the danger is that as we move away, well, it doesn't look like it at the minute, but as we potentially move away from the pandemic, the move will be to private transport and not to public transport. And you know, there's a real problem with exposure for pedestrians, cycling and motorcyclists, with an increase in private motor vehicle journeys. And that's why we think that there's a real need for political will to start to look at road user charging to drive down unnecessary and short motor vehicle journeys. And I think the other final area is just this single focus on the numbers of people solely killed and seriously injured. I think when you're really working hard to bring another agenda such as climate emergency, air quality, all the healthy streets scorecard, all the healthy streets work that London's done, I think there's a real need to bring other indicators, and potentially, you know, along the lines of healthy streets, you could have perceptions of safety on road, especially while walking and cycling, and also indicators that track progress in relation to reduction of vehicle speeds, volumes and intimidation. So there's three areas there, hopefully.
And is there anything else that you think is missing from the action plan? Anything you've highlighted there, other measures? Is there anything else that's missing, needs improving?
Yeah, well, I think we'll probably come on to those in a bit more detail later, but I think that there's a whole issue around how, you know, exactly as Tom said earlier, how the boroughs, are managed in terms of their procurement practices. I mean, I do think there is a real opportunity around autonomous emergency braking, around intelligent speeder system, you know, and I perfectly understand Neil's context, but I think what we're trying to do with the safe systems approach is we're trying to make the system safe for people so that when they do make mistakes, it's not fatal. And I perfectly understand, you know, that once casualties are reduced to a significant level, there will be a number of ones that are going to be very tough to reduce, and that's experience in Helsinki and Oslo. You know, they've got to a very low, through introducing safe systems, they've got to a very, very low level of casualties on the roads, but there remains a number of ones, exactly as Neil said, where it's difficult to address in the short term. So there's working vehicles, there's how the boroughs are encouraged to introduce. And I think that's, you know, I think that's the sort of main ones for now.
Now, we haven't got RNIB here, who we wanted to pick up some of the vulnerable road user points with, particularly people with disabilities. So I think I'll leave that. We may want to write to them. Just very briefly, to everyone, do you think that the Vision Zero targets for 2041 are achievable? I'm going to go to Tom first.
I don't think it's all or nothing. Oslo achieved Vision Zero in terms of fatalities. I certainly think we can try and achieve that. To what extent it'll be also true of serious injuries is we'll see. But I think we have to head for that direction, and I'm relatively optimistic in the sense that if we have shown that we can deliver infrastructure at a faster pace. If we can do 100 kilometres in 1 year, why can't we do 100 kilometres of cycle route, for example, in every year? We have seen that we can reduce motor traffic. Congestion charging has reduced it over periods of time, so we can reduce the traffic. And I think during lockdown we saw that as traffic reduced, so collisions reduced. So obviously there's a correlation between the number of vehicles on the roads. At the same time, we saw cycling soar. I don't know whether members are aware that according to the Department of Transport, cycling in London increased by 46% during lockdown. That's a huge increase. And that's on top of the doubling that we've seen before. And Transport for London recently did a survey, found that 40% of the respondents felt that they would like to cycle or cycle more. So the potential is there. And I think this is coming together with the technologies. So if we introduce, and I apologize for using the acronyms again, but ISA and AEB, there's no reason why we can't get speeds down to 20 miles an hour in residential streets, which will mean that if there are collisions, and we hope there are as few as possible, then they are of lower severity. Automatic emergency braking, if it's introduced on HGVs, buses, and we know that it's now already being made available, that can reduce the levels. If enforcement improves, and cameras are an obvious way of improving enforcement, I understand that some of the camera enforceable measures, road offences, are being extended next year, which will be a positive step. If cameras are there, people will behave in a more reasonable manner, so that will improve crash avoidance. And if we have much wider adherence to the measures that we talked about earlier, clocks, FORs, DVS, then those vehicles too will be less involved in collisions. So ultimately, I think we have the potential to head in the right direction. Lockdown has shown that we can move further in that direction, but there is, of course, a danger that people will go back to cars, will drive more, there'll be more congestion, more pollution, more emissions. I mean, we're now campaigning for climate-safe streets. That's what we really need.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And I realise, Alan, I'm so sorry. I think it's partly because of where you're sitting. I'm almost looking there at the guests. And whether... thank you. I'm so sorry, Alan. Can I bring you in, and then John wants to come in on this, whether you think it's achievable, and if you've got anything to add to the discussion so far. We will be getting into detail, obviously, shortly.
So just to be very brief, I think I would echo everything that Tom said, and equally with Jeremy so far. I think to add some additional evidence to what you were saying about the increase of cycling, and in terms of looking forward to the Vision Zero targets, I think it's certainly achievable to reduce fatalities down to zero, but it is going to take the type of step change that we saw the beginnings of evidence of during the pandemic is going to be possible in London. So, for example, in addition to what you were saying about the increase in cycling more generally, on streets where pop-up cycle lanes were introduced during the pandemic, where we also offer e-bikes alongside e-scooters in London,
of course do, yes.
We saw an increase of 136% in the usage of our riders travelling on the roads that had pop-up cycling lanes introduced, where previously there were none. That's obviously in a very limited case. It's a very specific case, but it does show the potential that is there if we get this question of infrastructure right. And certainly that's one of the things that we want to work very closely with cities around the world in. I think on the broader point, and your initial question, which I can obviously touch on briefly, in terms of kind of reflections on Vision Zero in London as a whole, I think we deal with cities all over the world. We operate in about 150 cities at the moment, including all over Europe and North America. And although there's still a lot of progress to go, it's without doubt that in the last few years, London has become a leading city in that area, alongside obviously Oslo, Helsinki, a lot of the other places in the Nordics that you guys will be familiar with. But in terms of progress in the last 3 years, London has certainly become a leading city. And actually, one of the things that we are really encouraged by as a private business and as someone who wants to do business in London and provide a new form of transport is the way that we've been able to work with TfL and with other partners to try and introduce a new mode into London that is something that's very new, very innovative, but also still with a focus on that Vision Zero target. And actually, that's really encouraging because on the perhaps converse of that, it would be a big negative if Vision Zero ended up in us limiting the sort of ambition about what we can do, the ambition around innovation, the ambition around introducing new transport modes. And actually, what's been excellent is through working with TfL, actually companies like ours and the other companies that are operating in London to provide the e-scooter trial at the moment, have been able to show how you can introduce an innovative new product, an innovative new travel option for people, but do it whilst keeping true to the Vision Zero principles. And actually, that's really encouraging, and it's something that not every city around the world has got right. So from our perspective, you know, it's a really positive step in that sense.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed. John, you wanted to come in on this, and then I think I'll bring in Assembly Member Garrett.
Yeah, thanks. And it's very much on the question you ask. Is it achievable? Will we ever get to zero? I'd like to think so. I think it's a realistic target. I think if we can aim to be there or thereabouts and going forward maintain that position, wonderful. It's doable. I think to get there, there needs to be a broader view. And I keep saying this, but it's very important to remember that if we're going to get to a perfect scenario, which I imagine is everyone's perfect scenario, there's very few cars on the road. Everyone travels by public transport. The people who move the public transport, we need to remember they're humans.
Yes.
The answer, as I said previously, the answer isn't solely in a mechanical answer. I think if you look at the bigger picture, we need to have some proper assessment on things. What actually works in London at the moment now, because we're going to have to take steps to there. Eventually, when we get to the nirvana, where very few cars are on the road and everyone's using public transport, there may be, and I don't mean to poo-poo over anyone else's ideas here, but from a bus driver perspective, one of the biggest concerns at the moment that keeps getting past to me is e-scooters, people weaving in and out. And maybe at this moment in time, with the weight of traffic as it is, maybe now's not the time for e-scooters. And we need to be used to introducing the ideas at the right time about this. At this moment in time, if we want to achieve the move to public transport, we need to think about what the public wants. There's surveys going on and they're going to lead to cuts on public transport. At this moment in time, during the COVID times, people don't want to be sitting next to each other. So if we want to remove the hazard of car drivers from the road, then we need to offer the public a decent public transport system. And that should include, and I appreciate that everyone wants the pandemic to be over, but it clearly isn't. I don't know, and several of us have made the mistake of thinking, oh, in the next 6 months, everything will be okay, and it hasn't been okay. I'm not going to make the same mistake of thinking in 6 months' time the pandemic will be clear, and next January we'll be in the same position. We need to start gearing for the here and now. And if we want people to go on public transport, then it has to be appealing. Is it a difficult, and I'm no scientist, so I'm not going to pretend I know, but I understand in operating theatres it's quite a simple mechanism to have air exchange systems where the air is drawn out of a bus. And this, if we could offer people that, then, or a train equally, tube, if we could offer people that, then surely they'd be more confident in going back to public transport. At this moment in time, I appreciate not everyone's going back to the office and less people now so, but before we got to this stage and everyone was starting to see the end of the light at the end of the tunnel, the evidence would show that public transport usage was at about 76%. Road usage had returned pretty much to normal. And that in itself should surely be an indicator that people aren't yet confident in public transport. So if we want to, and going back to the question, and I'm sorry for being so around the point, if we want to get to a place where we actually have vision zero in front of us, a lot of it depends on giving people confidence to use public transport to make the roads less busier so that the cyclists can be safer, the e-scooters can be safer, the pedestrians can be safer. I think everyone understands that. So public transport is at the very root of this. And to achieve the perfect standard, we're going to have to build confidence in the modal travel. And part of that also is looking after the people who operate the mode of travel, i.e. the drivers. Sorry if that's...
Lovely. No, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Assemblymember Garrett, you wanted to bring in a point here and then we'll move on to the next section.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Having mic trouble. There we go. I was struck by something actually that Lorraine was saying about how, you know, we're here having all these high-level conversations about Vision Zero and so on, and then there the bus drivers are who are a key part of this, and it's like an alien conversation that's going on somewhere else. So that's obviously quite alarming, and I think that's something we would want to look into. And I was just curious whether Lorraine had any thoughts on where, you know, somewhere between the GLA, TfL, the bus operators, the depot, and the bus drivers who are actually on the front line, somewhere in that process, that message is getting lost. And I don't know whether you had any thoughts, Lorraine, on sort of where you think it's going wrong, where it's getting lost, or, you know, or what, perhaps more importantly, what could be done to try and make sure that it actually is a real thing that's happening and not just a thing that we're talking about in this room and none of the drivers out there are really following.
I just think it's getting lost from the top downwards. I mean, we are reviewed as, you're just only bus drivers. We don't need to know. But we're frontline. We do need to know. It is down to us to make sure that it's Vision Zero out on the roads. But if we're not told about it, if we don't have a discussion, if nobody comes to our garages or even the operators and turn around and say, you know what, we need to educate the drivers on Vision Zero. Once that is done, we will be more aware of it ourselves.
Yeah. We're going to come on to this in a later section, so do we want to just pause it there and come back to that? Neil, you've indicated you want to come in quickly, and then I'm moving to Assemblymember Bailey.
Yep. As to whether you can hit Vision Zero or not, I'm agnostic about this, but I very much doubt it. But it seems to me it's a laudable aim. It's a bit like encouraging every school child to become an astronaut, knowing that 99.9% of them won't make it, and that's probably a high estimate. I think if you really want to get anywhere near your Vision Zero, there are some key things that you need to address which nobody wants to address. One of these is messaging, particularly with regard to cyclists who've been, in essence, put on a pedestal and led to believe that it's everybody else's job on the road to look out for their welfare and they don't have to look out for it themselves. I can tell you as a motorcyclist and everybody else I know who is an experienced motorcyclist, our view is that if we rode motorcycles the way a lot of pedal cyclists ride pedal cycles, we would have all been dead a long time ago. I mean, I see appalling cyclist use day in, day out, and you know, I can cite instances such as when myself and a colleague were actually going to a meeting at the House of Commons with a minister, and we were hit on a Pelican crossing on the Green Man outside the Commons by the cyclist representative who was coming to the meeting with us.
Okay.
You know, last week I saw a cyclist come through a red light in Castleford on a Green Man and knock down an elderly gentleman. If you want to go on the YouTube channel and look up Castleford Crime Watch, you can see a cyclist knocking down a young child in a pedestrian precinct. It's there. Have a look at it. And so long as you tell people that they have a bigger entitlement than everybody else, and you make them feel that it's not their responsibility to look out for themselves, it's everybody else's responsibility, they are going to keep on dying. And if you want a perfect read across from this, I'm an investment professional. You might have heard about London Capital and Finance, LCF. It was a big financial scandal. I was the guy that tipped off the Financial Conduct Authority 4 years before it went pop. One of the reasons why so many people were burned for £237 million in LCF was that they'd all been led to believe, or they'd convinced themselves, that no matter how recklessly they invested their money, they would all magically somehow be okay because the regulatory system would make sure that they never lost any money. So the end result of it was a big government inquiry chaired by Leach.
It's on. No, we can hear you.
Yeah. and ended up buying them off with a load of money. In reality, it was their own fault they lost the money because they behaved recklessly. If you encourage reckless behaviour by other people and you lead them to believe that whatever happens, they will be made whole and held harmless, they will come to harm. And it's an unpopular message, but it's one that you need to address.
Okay, thank you for that. Assemblymember Bailey, over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to our guests. I'm going to start with Tom, I believe. I'm going to start with Tom. Tom, has TfL missed an opportunity to improve road safety due to COVID? Because obviously COVID gave us a break in traffic levels. It meant people paying more attention. Have they missed an opportunity here?
Firstly, I'd like to disassociate myself and disagree entirely with the remarks made about making vulnerable people responsible. So I'm sorry I have to say that, but I want to make that clear. I think that people driving or riding have responsibility to look out for more vulnerable road users. That goes right from the top right down to the bottom. So lorry drivers have to look out because they're for everybody, because they're driving the largest vehicle. Then if I'm driving a car or a lorry, I have to look out for the cyclists, the pedestrians. If I'm riding a bicycle, I have to look out for the pedestrians, for the children and so on. I think we really have to take responsibility for other road users, and that goes from the top to the bottom. The bigger your vehicle, the greater the responsibility. But coming back to your question, missed opportunities, I think we have taken advantage of some of the opportunities. So introduction of larger quantities of cycle track has been a good thing to do. So I think we need to retain the best of what we've put in. And we've seen that in that first period of lockdown, I think collisions fell by, what was it, 52%, something like that. Well, that is the sort of level we would like to have going forward, and that is what enabled people to, in those circumstances, to choose to cycle. So yes, they were afraid of COVID. They may not have had access to whatever transport that they used to have, and they chose to ride bicycles. We need to capitalize on that interest. I mean, if we've got 46% more cycle trips out there, those are new people, and the London Cycling Campaign, a charity which seeks to improve conditions so that everyone can cycle, also does work to try and enable those people to cycle. We organise rides. We've been holding cycle buddy events for people who wish to have assistance with a particular route. We enable people, we direct people to things like bikeability. So if there are all those people interested in riding a bicycle or walking, we should try and keep them there rather than going back to motoring. And going forward, that will meet the targets in here.
But sorry to cut across you, Tom. It sounds like you've made great hay of the opportunity. I'm asking if you feel like TfL have made great hay with the opportunity to improve road safety while we've had the impacts of COVID. Because, of course, you've talked about 52% less collisions, and that's great. But also we had a very, very low level of economic activity, i.e. anybody on the roads in that time. So there's a cost there. So when TfL were looking at when they could do things, did they bear that cost in mind? Are they helping you continue to keep people on their bikes? What are TfL doing? I mean, if you don't see that they're doing anything, fine, but what are TfL doing?
Well, as I've said, I think the measures that have been introduced, whether that's temporary cycle lanes, I mean, I rode in a temporary cycle lane most of the way here. That is a good thing. So I think TfL have taken some opportunities. Okay. Some of the low traffic neighbourhoods, I've been cycling through those. There are kids cycling in those. I've never seen so many children on bicycles. School streets, what a great programme. 300 so far. I'd love to see it being 3,000 every school. At my son's school, the cycle scooter area is packed. It wasn't before. So there are good things. What we have to do is to keep those things. And I think there's a danger that we're slowing down now. And I think we need to maintain the pace. That's what's key.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. Can I move to Jeremy, please? Same question, Jeremy. Do you think there's any missed opportunities? Is there something extra that they could have been doing?
Thank you very much. I must say, I've felt that from TfL's point of view, I thought that the pandemic, from July onwards, was a time of, immensely taken opportunities. I thought the Streetscape programme was put together tremendously quickly. And I thought it probably didn't deliver perfect change, but it's given us some examples that can really, if we take those and, obviously it's all funding dependent now, but I just think there's a template there. Purely in terms of road casualties, the research that was done around the low traffic neighbourhoods, particularly for pedestrians, it shows there's a real opportunity if we can reduce through traffic in neighbourhood streets. Obviously, there's still huge amounts of work to do on main roads, especially for pedestrians, and I think we might talk about that. But I do think it was a time of opportunities taken.
So Jeremy, can I just quickly ask a quick question? So you said it reduced casualties. Was that with pandemic levels of traffic or general levels of traffic?
Yes, absolutely. I think overall there was a pandemic element related to traffic, but I think the research around the low traffic neighbourhood shows that where you reduce through traffic on neighbourhood streets, that reduces exposure and reducing through traffic will deliver significant pedestrian casualty reduction, which is what's been so hard to find over the last 10 years or so. Can I just say one more thing? I do think there was a missed opportunity, and I felt it was really encouraging that the congestion charge times were increased to weekends, were increased to evenings. I think there was a missed opportunity to take the evenings back again, and ideally one would have seen that continue till 10 o'clock in the evening.
But don't you think, so we're using the word opportunities, TfL, but do you think there would have been a cost to that particular opportunity you're talking about? So you're saying they should extend it. What would have been the cost?
Well, I think there is a notion. I understand the idea there could be an notional economic cost, but I do feel that, for not going into the evenings, you actually do make conditions less attractive for people on foot, who actually do form a huge part of the people using the nighttime economy in Soho and the West End in the evenings.
So you believe the cost would have balanced itself out? Or?
Yeah, and I think that, again, in terms of Vision Zero, which is we're focusing on today, but is not exclusive, I do think, I do think for all of those people who we want to encourage to use the West End and the city in the evening, I do think there was an addition of danger to those people.
Because the sort of opportunity versus cost, I think are we sometimes getting a reduction in casualties, etc., because we're just reducing the numbers of people who are able to get there, who are there. There's been a lot of talk about stats this morning. Like we talked about Helsinki, for instance. This is a question to all of our users. Is London comparable? Is the scale the same? Isn't Helsinki?
Question coming up.
Oh,
later,
excuse me. Sorry. Let me focus on that because these things, this idea is beginning to trouble me. Let me move on. How much consultation, again, to all of our guests who would be talking to TfL, how much consultation has there been between yourselves and TfL during the pandemic on how to protect your users? So, for instance, you are leasing e-bikes, etc. in London. Did you have any consultation with TfL on how to keep them safe?
So on that specific question, that was complicated slightly by the fact that we were in an open tender process. Okay. We're being run by TfL for lots of the pandemic, so there was no contact, obviously, in terms of respecting the protocols around that. I think what I would say on it is certainly once we were awarded one of the 3 contracts to operate our e-scooters in London, and once we were able to begin that engagement with TfL, safety was very much the first issue, and ensuring the safety of our users and other road users was very much the first thing that was approached by both us and TfL. And I think in the run-up to the launch of our scheme, so we worked for 3 or 4 months with TfL before it was launched, safety certainly was well over half of the time we spent consulting and engaging on how to operate the trial in the safest possible manner. Okay,
can I ask to Nick? Is Nick? Oh, sorry, I'm a bit confused as to who's here. Okay, I'm going to come back to Jeremy. Did you have a lot of consultation with TfL about how to keep your users safe, the people you represent, during the COVID period?
Yes, I mean, obviously, you know, when the first lockdown started, everything went very, very quiet, completely, you know, quiet, and then obviously, you know, there was a sort of some signs of optimism. You know, there was dialogue about the development of the streetscape plan. I think I would just say that there's two main things happened on the Vision Zero side, you know, over the course of the last 18 months. And to be fair to TfL, these were things that they encouraged to restart. So one of the devices for stakeholder engagement is this Vision Zero reference group where TfL, you know, works with stakeholder groups, you know, like all of us. And they started that again as quickly as possible. And again, there was the opportunity to feed in ideas to the progress report. And the other thing I'd say is, again, the Metropolitan Police Service were under, as you know, tremendous pressure over the last 18 months. Again, it wasn't easy for them to, but there's a group called the Vision Zero Enforcement Reference Group where, again, the Met Police, TfL talked to stakeholders about enforcement issues and traffic justice issues. Again, as soon as it was possible to have that dialogue, that start again, and that has been a really fruitful group and is absolutely part of the original Vision Zero action plan.
Did your level of consultation reflect what you felt would happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's been up and down. I mean, obviously lockdown is lockdown, and meetings would get cancelled. I mean, we have made every effort to try and communicate with TfL. TfL, you know, when you have a division enforcement group, for example, that was held up for almost a year, then it was revived. We've had communication about programs, advertising, that sort of thing. That communication wasn't ideal. I think TfL now recognises that they could do more in terms of communication on certain aspects. But yeah, I mean, I have to accept that lockdown doesn't make life easy. I think some of my colleagues have been in touch with Will Norman, the cycling commissioner, and I think that communication generally has been productive. But, you know, when we see things like junctions not being changed in full, that is something that obviously could be improved. So, yes, there's room for improvement, but I appreciate that lockdown doesn't make life easy.
Okay, thank you. My final question, I'm going to come to Jeremy again, is...
Can we just bring in Neil on motorcyclists?
Oh, please, Neil, go ahead.
Right, thank you, Caroline. I thought Sean made a brilliant point, which is obviously driving at, which was cost versus benefits. And I did hear Jeremy say that he talked about a notional economic cost. And this is not a notional economic cost at all. To the people that have to use motor vehicles in your charging zone, it's not a notional economic cost, it's a cost which they pay out of their pockets, which they pay out of their hard-earned wages, which they pay out of their self-employed profits through whatever they do for a living. And this whole debate, which seems to write off people who actually really do need to use motor vehicles to earn a living, is pretty much an upper middle class, very self-satisfied attitude, which mirrors the attitude that everybody can...
The question to you is about your users. You're here representing motorcyclists, not about your ideology and your views. We want to know,
this is not about ideology.
In terms of motorcyclists, how TfL during the pandemic worked with you to protect the users you represent. That's the question we're asking, please.
Well, the answer to that is not at all, because if you know anything about motorcycling, you know that you're riding on your own, you're not riding with other people. If you are, it's a pillion passengers, that's not a problem. And guess what? Motorcyclists all accept their own personal responsibility for their own safety. And that's a radical revolutionary idea, which I commend to all and sundry, in particular the representative of the cyclists, who doesn't seem to accept it at all.
Let me move to a last question. I do have to say, as someone who cycles quite a lot, I saw Neil's comment as all road users need to take responsibility for their own safety, partly as well. But let's move on. I can see the chair is getting antsy. I'm going to start with Jeremy, and then I'll come to you, Tom, and then I'll come to you, Neil. What impact do you think TfL's finances and the 11th of December deadline with the government's future funding will have on ability to reach zero vision targets?
Thank you. I think, I mean, obviously it's not quite clear how it's going to play out, but I think they are considerable. I think there's an awful lot of capital spend, you know, for example, on the rollout of 20 mile an hour on the Red Route network. For example, some of the initiatives around the safety camera safety camera work, they're absolutely dependent on capital spending. And if they're, you know, and if they don't happen, then a lot of that will be jeopardised. I think the other concern really is in relation to the police and crime plan and the potential around, you know, the enforcement levels. I mean, there's been a really, really encouraging story around enforcement levels, and the proposal in the progress report is that the number of offences prosecuted for speeding goes to 1 million from 280,000. Again, you know, that enforcement is dependent on funding for the partnership of TfL and the Metropolitan Police, and if that doesn't happen, I think there's a real danger that that enforcement won't happen in the longer term.
Tom? Press your mic, Tom. Your mic.
Apologies. Yeah, I share Jeremy's views. I think it's vital that we progress with all of the programs that we have going. I mean, it's without the funding and available for whether it's Vision Zero or infrastructure, we will not meet the targets that both the government is setting and TfL is setting. We need to come out of this terrible pandemic with what is dubbed a green recovery. And we need to invest in that green recovery, because there's potential for coming out of it well, and there's a potential for coming out of it badly.
So you're linking the green recovery to the Vision Zero. Is that a link for you?
Yeah, I made that point at the very beginning. I think that Vision Zero and road danger are inextricably linked to transport choice. There are a lot of people out there, whether it's you or me or anybody else here, who make a decision based on what we see on the roads, and if we see danger on the roads, we choose to adjust our transport accordingly. If we want to move to what the Mayor says is a 80% public transport walking and cycling usage from a 63% level at the moment, then we need to make the modes that we seek to increase attractive and not impacted by fear of danger, fear of road danger. So that's why the investment is absolutely vital. I mean, it's investment for the future. It will change, it will transform transport in London and make London continue to run as a city. And it could become a city that we're really proud of. I mean, some other cities are already looking to London as an example of where you can go. It's not just Oslo and Helsinki. There are things that are happening here that other people are asking about. I was called by someone who was a former Canadian minister to ask about the progress on lorries. And I was happy to pass on some of the measures that we have introduced here. So we need to go forward, and we need to keep investing in order to have a satisfactory city. Because, I mean, we wrote a letter in conjunction with lots of other organizations to the minister to make that very clear.
But it would sound, if you link the green and the Vision Zero, there might be places that the Mayor could spend money that would be more impactful for our green agenda than they would for the Vision Zero.
As I say, I think they're linked. I think one helps the other. So if we progress with Vision Zero, we reduce the danger, we increase active travel, and that helps with emissions, that helps with congestion, that helps with pollution, that helps with individual health.
The chair is getting antsy. Neil, would you like to add something?
I think I've made most of the points there, but you know, I would like to reiterate that I am a pedal cyclist myself. We cycle as a family. We always have 5 of us. Me, my wife and 3 kids. So I'm not blind to the dangers which cyclists face, and we need to leave identity politics out of this. It's not car drivers versus bikers versus cyclists versus pedestrians. I am variously a pedestrian, a pedal cyclist, a motorcyclist and a car driver, and my experience of each influences and informs my attitude to the way other road users behave. What I'm saying is, it's very simple. If you want less cyclists to die, you need to get the messaging, ride defensively. It is that simple and that clear. We ride defensively as motorcyclists. It's how we stay alive. And you need to alter the messaging completely if you want less of your friends to die, Mr. Bogdanowicz.
Thank you, Neil. I'm sure we'll come back to that. I think, Chair, at some point we need to look at the benefits. I think sometimes the conversation, the cost versus the benefit is not being looked at. Thank you.
Okay, perhaps you can put your mask on and sort out your phone going off, please. And can I just, we've got a lot of questions still to get through, members. Guests, could you try to be a little bit shorter, but also you're here to talk about the users you're representing rather than your views of the world and whatever. I'm just really conscious we've got an awful lot to get through to get the evidence we need on this. We're going to look at progress on initiatives now. Assembly Member Berry, and you're going to keep your mask on, I think, for your section.
I am, as long as everyone can hear me okay, then I will. I just want to ask one point of clarification from the last section, yes or no, if that's okay. Is it the case that Motorcycle Action Group does not actually have a place on either the Vision Zero reference group or the Vision Zero enforcement reference group?
I don't believe we do have a place.
Use your microphone.
Sorry. No, we don't have a place now.
Is that's really interesting and probably to be noted.
We'd be very happy to take one up if you're offering one.
Thank you very much.
We have that power.
We don't have we can make recommendations, and there will be no voting at the end of this meeting either, so it's not a case of winning a debate today. So I want to talk to speed limits, and I know that, Jeremy, you've brought this up a couple of times already. Can you tell us what evidence you have and what information you have about how the rollout of 20 mile per hour speed limits has affected safety on the roads when it's gone to new boroughs? I know that more boroughs have now adopted this. There are fewer gaps in central London. Outer London still doesn't have a lot of 20 mile an hour default limits, but how has, where it's been introduced, affected road danger?
Yes, I mean, and there's a sort of, thank you very much for that question. There's a number of dimensions to this. I think there's how far London's got. There's what, for example, there's a really positive initiative in the progress report about TfL starting to want to work with government around a 20 mile an hour default as a pilot project, which is really exciting. There's the work with the boroughs, there's the work on the TLRN, the Red Route network, and then there's general sort of lobbying around 20. I mean, what's really exciting is the progress on 20 mile an hour in London. I mean, even in the last year, City of Westminster, Kensington, Chelsea, Merton, and then they've all gone 20. And really exciting is the fact that Wandsworth has recently made every borough managed road except for one 20 mile an hour. So the boroughs that have taken up 20 mile an hour are seeking to go further with it. And then I think but as you say, it's almost universally 20 mile an hour across inner London now. When we move to the outer boroughs, there's lots of examples now of boroughs that have gone 20 miles. Really interesting work going on in Kingston around a couple of the neighbourhoods, of the 2 of the 4 neighbourhoods there having gone 20 mile an hour. And then obviously, if I give examples, I'll start to miss out boroughs, but examples such as Waltham Forest and Croydon that have also gone 20. But there are a number of boroughs that haven't gone 20. Some of them don't want to go 20 miles an hour, but there's a number of boroughs that do want to go 20 miles an hour. And I think one of the opportunities, and I think TfL is very aware of it, is giving them support to make the leap. And I think there are everybody's uncertain about LIP funding, and also there are priorities in LIP funding. But I think, it's really important that if we're going to take advantage, as Tom talked about earlier, of the introduction of intelligent speed assistance in 2022 and 24, it's really important that the boroughs that want to go 20 mile an hour are there so they can take advantage of it. And obviously really exciting as well, we talked about it earlier, is mandatory intelligent speed assistance on almost half of buses by the end of next year. So all the boroughs that want to go 20 mile an hour really should be encouraged to. The 20 mile an hour programme on the TLRN has gone really well. It's beefed up in the progress report. I think what's going to be really, really interesting is where that goes in terms of being cost effective and and also now, given there's not going to be a lot of funding to make sure there's strong compliance with it, what are the tricks that can be used to make sure that where the TLRN goes 20 mile an hour, that can be as close to a maximum as possible? And examples in Camberwell, Tooley Street, of really, low cost use of signs and lines, speed cameras, 24/7 bus lanes, a whole array of, introducing protected cycle lanes, just using wands, so low cost interventions. And I do think that there's a task to be done of these large sections of the TLRM that are proposed to go 20 mile an hour. How do you make the compliance stronger? And I think there's a lot of things can be done around that.
Thank you. Sorry, delay on turning my microphone on then. You mentioned the Transport for London road network there a few times. That's effectively the strategic road network in London. It seems, I've got the map, the most recent map of speed limits here. It seems like there's still an awful lot of the TLRN that is not at 20 miles an hour, even through central London. Would you support that becoming more of a default? I know the Assembly considered but didn't vote for a motion to make it 20 miles an hour wherever there's a pavement, for example, so ignoring some of the more strategic and motorway-style roads. Would you support that becoming a default? And are you saying that that's not feasible until you've done some physical measures?
I'm not sure it's about physical measures. I think there's some work to be done to improve compliance. I think, to be fair, the programme to 2024 is virtually bringing in a default 20 mile an hour across inner London, inner London, where roads. All those roads that are absolutely appropriate to 20 mile. I do think TfL is moving to that. Obviously, it's funding dependent, and it's a 2-year programme to 23-24. So I think they're very much aiming for that. I think it's important to do other stuff additional that's compliant, but it's not going to be raised tables or things like that. It's going to be mostly signs and lines and some elements of enforcement.
Okay, and then you've talked a little bit about intelligent speed limit. Intelligent speed assistance, is that what it's called now? Yes. So that is where the cars or vehicles are programmed to know the speed limit and stick to it. So in terms of compliance, if you were to make it the default on even the more sort of main road seeming TLRN stretches, that would keep a lot of vehicles within that limit, wouldn't it?
Yeah, there's two elements to this. Okay, so there's mandatory intelligent speed assistance, and that's what's been fitted on a number of the buses and is proposed to be rolled out quite significantly, retrofitted and on new buses to, over the next couple of years. That is, from the research that was done when TfL first looked at this, the compliance level with 20 mile an hour speeds is 97 to 99%. So that is a game changer. And that's why I was really excited about, and Tom touched on this, the idea of procurement practices. If, for example, TfL gets the boroughs to be mandating mandatory speed limit on new vehicle, on their own fleets, and on vehicles that say they're doing, contractors for housing repairs, that again could be a game changer, because working vehicles could suddenly be much, much safer and pose less danger. So there's the idea of mandatory ASA, which could be really powerful on working vehicles. Then there's, this is where it gets confusing, is the regulations that were inherited from the European Union. I think it's not... These are general safety regulations in that territory. And essentially, if the government chooses to adopt that or a version of that, there will be intelligent speed assistance on all new models of vehicles from 2022 and all new cars from 2024. The problem is there's been a lot of watering down of the ISA that's proposed, whereby it looks like now one of the systems that the manufacturers may be able to fit is simply an audible warning that then can be turned off, rather than the idea of you press the accelerator and there's a pushback against it. So the danger is that, even in Europe, this will be watered down, and obviously one's not got a sense of what the government will introduce here. But again, potentially immensely powerful.
Yeah. Okay, the other thing to ask about is enforcement of the speed limits by the police, effectively. We've asked at the last Assembly plenary meeting the Met to produce an enforcement dashboard, because they don't currently have that. We have a dashboard, which we'll talk about later, for collisions and injuries, but not for the enforcement activity, which I think, you know, there are no targets for that, so that will come. What do you think what more can be done to ensure that there is more enforcement of these speed limits, and do the police play an important role, therefore, in achieving Vision Zero?
Absolutely. I mean, the hope is in the longer term we'll move from enforcement to compliance. So the opportunities that ISA offers moves that, you know, it's not enforced, people become compliant, and then hopefully there isn't the overriding of, you know, the systems that are fitted. However, now the police are immensely important. They played a very, very important role so far. So one of the key planks of the original Vision Zero action plan was the 3-tier enforcement programme. And, you know, when Andy Cox was in charge of that, he was a real proponent of that and helped introduce that. The progress report looks at, as I understand it, the back office improvements that were needed in Marlow House to go from, you know, around 200 offences to be processed a year to 1 million offences a year, that system is now in place, and there's a ramping up of the potential to enforce those systems. Officer enforcement has been really increased, and that happened especially when there was high levels of speeding early in the pandemic. The police have set up this road crime team as well. So I think the police have played a significant part. There's a real worry if the funding is reduced that they won't be able to do what's planned for the next, such as new safety cameras for the next stage of the programme.
Okay, thank you very much. I was due to ask RoadPeace and also Lorraine about the impacts on different road users, but I think if I just start with Lorraine and ask about bus drivers and how you feel about speed limits on different roads and whether ISA is a useful thing.
The problem that we have with speed limits as a bus driver is we drive to a timetable. We drive to what is called a headway. So now that we're coming across like roads that had the 20 miles an hour speed limit, our timetables haven't been changed to take into consideration that we're actually going 10 miles less, as doing 20 as opposed to 30. So that is a problem that we're actually having. The buses are excellent where you have the speed limit and the bus will actually reduce its speed down to 20 miles an hour. But TfL have never, ever taken into consideration late running of buses. If we get caught in, I mean, truthfully speaking, it is a good idea, even as a road user driving a car, the speed limits are a good idea. However, as a bus driver who drives 7 days a week, 12 hours a day with a 40-minute break, I am on the road, or my colleagues are on the road more than anybody else in this room. Nobody takes any notice. We need more policing of the speed limits. We go slow, we do 20 miles an hour. The car behind, he's not interested. He wants to overtake us, and he will overtake us, and he will cut in front of us. What do we have to do? We have to brake sharply. We then put our passengers at risk. We risk, if it's a wet road, hitting the offender, whatever you want to call them, then that impacts on Vision Zero. Because, again, it's a statistic that there's another accident on the bus or off the bus. But we think it is a good idea. Oh, my days. Oh, sorry. We do think it is actually a good idea, and we're happy to drive at 20 miles an hour, and the more roads that are like that, the better. We just need them to recognise the fact that they need to alter our timetables and the duties to take it into consideration.
That's really interesting. Thank you very much for that. We're bringing in TfL and the MAP to the next meeting, so we've got some questions to follow up with them.
A lot of good points to be picking up for our next meeting. Assembly Member Clarke.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm just going to carry on with you, Jeremy. Thank you so much for your comments on speeding. I was just yesterday, I was out with residents in West Finchley, which is in Barnet, absolutely desperate to get their speed limit lowered to 20. And it is very, very difficult in some boroughs, particularly boroughs like Barnet, to get them to reduce the speed limit where there isn't the political will to do so. And I'm just very grateful for your comments. Just wondering, should the government bring forward 20-mile-per-hour pilots, including in London, equivalent to the work being led by Welsh and Scottish governments?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. I mean, I'm not going to go over the same territory again, but it is really exciting that TfL has moved this point from an appendix in the last report to something that's really up front in this report. I mean, as you've just said, I mean, it looks like Wales, Scotland are going to go 20 mile an hour within the next 2 or 3 years. There are now over 26 million people across the UK living in 20 mile an hour local authorities. I mean, it is moving to the default. The United Nations has made it clear that it feels that globally the default speed limit should be either 30 kilometres an hour, sorry, in urban areas or in places where people and vehicles mix, it should be 20 miles an hour, 30 kilometres an hour. TfL's intervention here is really valuable, bringing 8 million or so people in potentially to have a default 20 miles an hour. Sorry, this is probably too optimistic. It feels like it's only a matter of time now before the UK moves to a general 20 mile an hour default in urban areas, obviously with appropriate exceptions for more major arterial roads where the people and vehicles don't mix. But this is very, very useful, and I do feel that in some of the boroughs that don't want to move to 20 mile an hour in London, there's a tremendous desire of residents to do that, and I feel that it's a case of the leadership of the boroughs trying to listen to those residents rather than feel they don't want to take on what I think would be a really progressive move.
Thank you, Jeremy. How useful is the Vision Zero dashboard as a tool for your organisation in understanding progress made on Vision Zero?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I'm finding it really valuable to help people find out what's happening in their area. So, there's a number of things you can do in it. You can actually really narrow the dates down you want to look at. You can look at people by age group. You can look at, obviously, on a borough basis. It's really, really helpful to be able to point people and have a really easy to use tool. The other thing that's really encouraging is the data is far more up to date than we've seen typically in the past. So people are using much more current data. I think, there's not a lot of faults with it. And one thing it would be useful if they did include elements such as the speed limit of the road involved, to tie in a bit more with some of the wider dimensions of the Stats 19 data, or, the road classification or who the highway authority is. But that's a bit nitpicking. It's a very useful tool. People find it relatively easy to use.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Lovely, thank you. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you very much. Jeremy, really, excuse me. In relation to 20 miles an hour, obviously what you're suggesting is that the 20 mile an hour speed limit should be regardless of the width of the road, the length, whether it's a windy road, straight road. Can I ask you, is it a situation whereby if the 20 mile an hour speed limits are put into areas where they are more relevant, i.e. outside schools, areas where there's narrow roads or lots of parked cars and so on, would that not be more effective than making drivers drive at 20 miles an hour for the entirety of their journey when, say, for instance, as I have sometimes done, gone all the way to Croydon on a Sunday morning with not another single car on the road, and I'm forced to drive at 20, which I find a little frustrating, but I do know as well that if another car does come on that road, he will come up behind me, sit on my tail, and then dangerously overtake me as soon as he possibly can, or she, but it's usually a he actually, to be fair. That, in my view, is more likely to cause an accident than if we were able to drive at 30 in a sensible situation. And I absolutely get that one needs to drive at 20 in more hazardous environments. Sorry for the long question.
No, that's very clear, thank you. So I think it needs to be made really clear that this is a default speed limit. It's not a blanket speed limit. So, for example, Croydon's a really good example. Richmond would be another example. Because of the characteristics of those boroughs, what they did when they introduced the default speed limit was say, the borough-managed roads will go to 20 miles an hour. However, there are roads which are not appropriate for that, and in consultation with residents, they listened to the feedback from residents and accepted those roads. So I think typically, it's about the roads where people and vehicles mix, and I do think for a lot of London, that's nearly all of those roads. So the roads that we accept will be relatively few. I hear your point about schools. I've certainly heard that before. My concern about that is that a bit like school streets in a way, they focus really around the school itself and they don't think about the whole journey to school. And I think the great concern is that we focus the safety just on the school gate, but we don't actually then make safe the whole journey to school. So I do think that it's a broader conversation than trying to pick up individual locations and make them safe. I do think that, I perfectly understand the point you made earlier, but I do think drivers do ask for consistency, and I think it's a lot easier when there's a consistency to the speed limit. And obviously, as I said, if there is an arterial road that's not appropriate, then that will, of course, remain at 30 miles an hour or above.
Yeah, I do concede that it is a nightmare driving down to Croydon, because 1 minute it's 30, next minute it's 20, then it's 30, 20, and in the end, if it wasn't for the fact that I've got a little thing on my car that tells me what the speed limit is, I wouldn't have a clue, to be perfectly blunt. But I just want to develop that a little bit more. Can you give me any examples, or are there any figures that show that reducing real life examples, not laboratory testing, are there any examples where reducing the speed limit to 20 miles an hour, which boroughs have actually seen any reduction in KSIs or deaths? But of course, taking in mind we can't really use the COVID period because that's an anomaly.
I think that's a really good question, and I think I'll be honest. We have seen. We've seen a lot of research around the impact on vehicle speeds in London, where the boroughs have gone 20. We haven't seen data in particular about the impact on casualties. However, and I promise I won't go through it now, there's a lot of work on this across, and I'm happy to supply it to the committee afterwards, of course. There's a lot of work across the UK that and obviously led by, one example is TRL, the research they did a couple of decades ago, which was for every 1% reduction in, 1 mile an hour reduction in average speed, there's a 6% reduction in casualties in an urban setting. So that research is there. I'll be honest, I've seen speed limit impacts from the boroughs and, how average speeds have declined with the introduction of 20 miles an hour, but I haven't seen casualty data. And that's probably because in London there are so many other variables that, probably make that a bit difficult to isolate.
It's difficulty because I always quote, I think it's Portsmouth and Bath, where they put 20 mile an hour blanket speeds in, and after a period of time, both said they regretted it. It had no effect on reducing casualties, and if they had the money, they'd reverse it.
Jeremy, if you want to send us, if you've got
it'd be grateful if you have
any
that
info you've got on that. Thank you. Right, do you want to move on to the next bit?
Yeah. So this question is for Lorraine. What more can be done to support safe behaviour for different types of road users, do you think, Lorraine?
We have to concentrate on the bus drivers themselves. We have to think about the fatigue. Like I said, we do 10 to 12 hours, 7 days a week with a 40-minute break. Now, if we're going to be driving at 20 miles an hour, which is all well and good, it will reduce the accidents down. Not that we have a lot, to be quite honest, on average with other road users. I just think that we have to TfL has to focus more on the bus driver industry, in order to take into consideration the 20 miles an hour roads. like you said, driving down to Croydon, Streatham High Road is an absolute nightmare. Cars whiz past, lorries whiz past us, and we will never have an opportunity to get Vision Zero where accidents or incidents are concerned unless other factors are brought into consideration. Metropolitan Police, they just see speeding cars in a 20 mile an hour zone, and they don't do anything about it. And we look at them as if to say, well, aren't you going to stop him? You know, you're putting that behaviour in a 20 mile an hour zone is putting other people at risk. What I've actually noticed is roads where it's 20 miles an hour, pedestrians are more likely to cross the road anywhere as opposed to crossing at a zebra crossing or a red light or the pedestrian crossing. That has to be taken into consideration with drivers that aren't taken into consideration at 20 miles an hour.
Okay, just a supplementary on that, Lorraine. So, do you think that if TfL were more, and the bus driving companies, do you think if they were more focused on safety rather than achieving the time goals, do you think that would help?
They need to be more focused on safety.
Yeah, and do you have any evidence of them focusing on safety over delivering targets?
Do you know what? Truthfully speaking, the bus industry is all over the place. At the moment, we're fighting fatigue. We do drive the safety aspect of TfL with the bus industry and bus drivers, 100%. We have to be absolutely perfect. But like I said, we are human beings. We can make a mistake. We often do make a mistake. We don't get up in the morning and say, this is what we're going to do.
Sure.
But it happens. But the pressure that TfL put the companies under drops down onto the bus drivers. So we're under pressure to keep to the timetable, to keep to our duty, to make sure we come in on time. So for us bus drivers, we have to balance our health and safety as well as keeping to the speed limits.
That's very useful evidence. Thank you. John, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, thanks for that. Look, going back to the original point, and just so that you're aware, I haven't always been a regional officer of United Union. I spent 24 years being a bus driver, and I happen to agree with everything Lorraine said up to this point, by and large. Look, the safety, when we talk about the 20 miles per hour, bus drivers will drive at whatever speed you require them to drive, as long as they've got the tools to do it. I think it was Churchill who said that. So the speed limit of 20 miles an hour, 30 miles an hour, 40 miles an hour, it doesn't substantially make a great deal of difference to the bus driver. Where it does impact, it's the monitoring of this and the enforcement of this. And it's a point Lorraine made earlier. A more traumatic one is the go-ahead driver who was killed by another dangerous driver, where the driver was actually propelled through the window and into another bus, but a different thing for a different day. We need to ensure there's enforcement, because several people so far have made the point that if the bus drives at 20 miles an hour, someone's going to overtake them, and that puts them on the other side of the road in conflict with another vehicle. So enforcement is fundamental to all of this. Having some roads at 20 miles an hour, some roads not at 20 miles an hour, the problem with that is it creates rat runs. And you'll see this, and whether it's considered evidence, but if there's roadwork somewhere, everyone diverts off down the other streets. This increases the traffic down there, whereas people aren't necessarily used to it, and as a consequence, there's a risk of it increasing the risk of accident. I think those are the 2 points I wanted to put over. Thank you.
Yeah, can I take that point up with Tom? With every road being 20 miles an hour, I mean, I used to, for a while I was living in Lewisham, and the main roads, if you can call them that, were 30 miles an hour and the side roads were 20. So it wasn't that advantageous to take the side roads. But when everything is 20 miles an hour, wouldn't that mean that you're then once again encouraged to use the side roads rather than the main roads?
I thought that what Jeremy said was correct, that we're talking about a default speed limit of 20 miles an hour on residential streets, and where a borough or a traffic highway authority feels there is a need for a speed of 30, 40, 50 miles an hour, then that would apply. I mean, that's roughly what they do in some European countries. In Holland, you've got, you know, they have home zones where you might even have to travel more slowly than 20 miles an hour. In some cases, they're restricted to 10 miles an hour. You wouldn't think of driving through a housing estate at 20 miles an hour because it'd be too fast. You don't drive at 20 miles an hour through a car park. So there are speeds that are appropriate on residential streets. And I recently cycled in Barnet, and there was a very big sign on a narrow residential street saying, please stick to 30 miles an hour. And I thought it was unfortunate that the residents of that street had to experience, presumably, vehicles travelling at significantly above 30 miles an hour because, you know, that's why they had this sign.
Fine, so if I can now ask... So, yep, carry on, thank you. All right, okay. So, Jeremy, do you think that the targets for Vision Zero are the right ones?
Thank you. Yes, I think the main target is an appropriate one to look at fatalities and serious injuries. That is an appropriate target. We've suggested broadening this, and perhaps, you know, to pick up with Tom's point earlier about, you know, this wider agenda, and also to tie in closely with the work around healthy streets. We suggested including, perhaps not as a target, but as a part of the information that's provided as this work goes on, perceptions of safety on the roads, especially while walking and cycling, and that's an integral part of a Healthy Street Scorecard. And then we suggested as well indicators that track progress on reductions in average speeds, volumes, and perceptions of intimidation by motor vehicles. And just, I don't know whether you know about the Healthy Street Scorecard. That's a monitoring device that's published every year based on publicly available data. There's a number of those indicators that, again, might be quite useful to TfL and as part of this work, or even for the committee, around potentially sustainable mode share, so the proportion of journeys that are made by public transport, walking, cycling, levels of active travel, the prevalence of low traffic neighbourhoods, 20 mile an hour speed limits, and also the amount of physically protected cycle track on main roads. So it could be broadened. The focus is the right one, but there's a chance to make it a bit richer by looking at some other indicators as well.
And do you think enough's been done to improve road safety for pedestrians post-pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting point. And obviously, as Living Streets is something that really concerns us. And I mean, there's probably, I'm just trying to simplify this a bit. I think there's two dimensions to this, really. And I think, you know, whether it's post-pandemic or not, this is work in progress. I mean, I think the key location where there is danger for pedestrians is on main roads. Sorry, this is in a London context, and especially high streets and town centres. And I think that, you know, and again, you know, there's funding issues involved, but all of the, you know, what we would say is all of the focus needs to be on things like, again, the missing pedestrian crossings. We really need to tackle those locations where there are crossings and there are missing there's no green man crossing at all, or there are arms that are missing. And there's examples around here where that's the case. Signal timings that, you know, again, there's a potential trade-off with bus times and general traffic times, but again, pedestrian wait times and crossing times can be an issue. There's the potential, as being trialled in Manchester, of side road, zebra crossings. The B-line crossings. Again, if they become allowed, there's a fantastic opportunity to give pedestrians priority there. 20 mile an hour speed limit, obviously, really. Another area that's really sort of unexplored in London is traffic-free areas. So again, I think there's a chance to make more. Obviously, you've got to be careful to make sure these are economically successful with time. Make sure time deliveries can occur. But having traffic-free areas, again, you know, that's what the spirit was behind the Oxford Street approach, which could have been tremendously, you know, added a lot of economic vibrancy because of the suspended pedestrians. Yes, sorry.
If you say traffic-free areas, does that include push bikes as well?
Well, I mean, I think it's areas where, you know, those non-mechanical transport modes, you know, work well together, and it is certainly possible to devise shared, you know, spaces where both of those can work. And obviously the work around the Strand is going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. So it's a pedestrian area, but obviously people cycling through there either dismount or go at very careful speeds, and I'm sure that can be designed. Sorry, and just finally, I think there's a really important piece, promise last point, is a really important piece about pavements. They need to be wide, accessible and clutter-free. So that's the town centres. And then I think in the neighbourhood streets, I think we're finding tremendous potential in removing through traffic from neighbourhood streets. I think there's, again, the potential for pedestrians is very exciting.
That's very kind of you. Thank you very much. Neil, got some questions for you. Do you think enough is being done by the Mayor and TfL to persuade all London boroughs to allow motorcycles to use their bus lanes?
No, I don't. And I know that the Mayor says that he does support bikes in bus lanes, but I think this is an agenda that needs to be propagated much more aggressively than it is being done. It's been proven over a very long period now, ever since we got bikes into bus lanes in Bristol, the best part of 30 years ago, that bikes don't cause buses any problems, they don't cause other bus lane users any problems, but they do make motorcycling much safer and reduce motorcycle casualties.
Right, thank you. What else would you suggest could be done to reduce motorcycle deaths?
Now, I understand that you've had, I think it was an average of 30 deaths a year up until very recently, and deaths have dropped to, I think it was 4 or 6 in the last year. And to answer that question really intelligently, somebody needs to go back through all the statistics and try and find out why each of these accidents happened. I analysed 20-odd years' worth of statistics of accidents on the M62 motorway more than 20 years ago, and that was very informative, and that was in connection with the Wire Rope Crash Barriers project. So if you go back to the data and find out why the accidents are happening, then you can look at addressing the reasons. But one thing everybody should understand is this: if you ride a motorcycle, you do not want to hit anything at all. A dog will bring you off your bike. At the best, it's a load of expensive repairs. At the worst, it's death. I understand that the gentleman who runs the Parliamentary Advisory Committee for Transport Safety has produced a report, Who Kills Who, and he says that motorcyclists kill a disproportionate number of pedestrians. If that's happening, then I guarantee that's happening because people are walking out into the path of motorcycles, or, as I've experienced, into the side of a passing motorcycle, simply because they're not looking where they're going. And such accidents are as likely, and sometimes more likely, to result in a KSI to the motorcyclist than to the pedestrian that walks out in front or into the side of them. You don't want to hit anything if you're on a bike, because even a dog or a cat will bring you off. I had a badger come out into the front of my old Rover 75, did 1,200 quid's worth of damage. If it had come out into the front of my bike, that would have probably killed me.
Yeah. Okay, very quickly then. What impact do you think the removal of road space and narrowing of lanes has had on motorcycle safety?
Disastrous and deadly. The more you compress motorcycles into a limited amount of road space with well-protected people in cars, the more motorcyclists are going to be KSI. It's as simple as that.
Okay. And then what is MAG's view on the best way to include motorcycling in the modal mix on roads?
We would like to be in all the consultations, and as I've said, if there's a place on your Vision Zero committee, we would certainly take that up. We, as an organisation, have a stated what is MAG statement. I've got a copy with me, you can have it if you want. And part of that is that we all accept personal responsibility for what we do. I don't think there's any place in all of this for sort of dogma and identity politics. I think if you are going to get one thing across that's going to make everybody safer, it's that everybody needs to look out for everybody else, but everybody also does need to look out for themselves.
Okay. And if you could share those statements with the committee as additional evidence, just email it to us, be really helpful.
Okay, thanks.
Do you want to pick up the training question,
Yes, I do, yeah, thank you. So again, how useful do you think the training is that is offered by TfL for motorcycle users? And do we need more training for motorcyclists?
I think motorcyclists today are better trained than they ever have been. It's certainly not the scenario when I started motorcycling on the road in 1981, when I literally bought a bike and was shown where the controls were and wobbled off into the traffic. I don't think lack of training is an issue at all these days. And where there is a perception of motorcyclists riding very badly, and I see it myself, 99 times out of 100, it's people who are riding illegally. And, you know, I see it where I live, and I'm sure you see it in London as well. And, you know, I see some appalling riding, but it's by people who I know are not riding legal motorcycles. They probably don't have a license, they certainly don't have insurance.
Do you think that the delivery companies and the fast food companies do enough to train the people they put on their bikes before they let them on the road, though?
In my experience, most of them do next to nothing, and I think they have a very cavalier attitude to the safety of their workers.
Thank you. That's good for me.
Assembly Member Baker, and then I'm going to bring in Assembly Member Rogers, who's got a follow-up.
Thank you. This is first question is for Tom at the LCC, and it's a similar question around training. So is there enough that could be done to support cyclists through training to help them manage risk, and is there sufficient money to support this?
Yeah, well, as you obviously training is a useful adjunct to introduction of decent infrastructure. I think anybody can benefit of it, but from it, particularly children. There was a programme which was developed in quite a number of schools. It's sort of training. I mean, Neil was talking about defensive riding, and that's what it teaches both adults and children. And that programme was being progressed in several hundred schools successfully, but funding has recently been cut back, and that is a big blow. I mean, it's a big blow not only for the children who will miss out on that training, but it's also a blow from the perspective of the instructors and the people who have invested the time in getting the expertise to be instructors. And we will come out of the pandemic with a situation where children haven't been trained and there are insufficient qualified instructors to assist them. There is also the issue of driver training. And one of the problems is that I think a lot of drivers may not be particularly those who don't ride bicycles themselves. You know, in Holland, there's a different situation. Pretty much everybody drives and rides, and everybody's familiar with the behaviors of both types of vehicle. And the Dutch do have a training program for all their schools, and all children are given cycle training. But here we embarked on a program of safer urban driving. It's a module developed for lorry drivers, and we think it's been successful. Most of the drivers who do the module say that it has been positive for them. It helps them understand how cyclists move on the road. And I think, and Neil's talking about defensive riding, I think it may be understood from the perspective of someone's on a motorbike, but it's not necessarily understood that someone on a cycle might take a similar approach. So approaching a junction, a cyclist might be in the center of the lane so that a vehicle doesn't cut across him. I mean, I was riding in today, and I was in a cycle lane, and a vehicle stopped, you know, driving alongside, and it stopped for me to pass. I was impressed, and it's great if people do that, and I think we need to get to that stage. And so safer urban driving for lorry drivers is positive. I'd like to see it become a standard module for the lorry drivers to do, rather than just one of several, so that they could do first aid 3 times instead of doing safer urban driving and first aid and something else. So we'd like to see that happen at the governmental level, to introduce that kind of program for lorry drivers as a standard part of their training. So yeah, both cycle training for kids is important, and cycle training for drivers, and also for the adults who are taking up cycling. You know, there are so many new riders out there, we've been offering a bike buddy program. So, you know, I've been out with parents and kids and shown them some of the new cycle routes. Because, again, we've had these 100 kilometres of routes proposed or completed and others proposed. But not everybody knows about them. And I think Assembly Member Bailey was asking about what TfL could be doing more. Well, they could be publicising that sort of facility because, yes, I know how to get from here to North London and from here to Kensington Palace without encountering a car. But not all of you would be able to answer that. I mean, I'm in the business, you're not, so you can't be expected to know that.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. Didn't you want to come in now? Or no, that's fine. Beg your pardon. I've got some more questions, some follow-up questions around, back to Lorraine and John from Unite. Again, firstly about training. Lorraine, do you feel that there's been sufficient training offered to bus drivers on these safety issues, all the safety issues that we've been discussing?
Yes, I do. We are highly trained, especially cyclists, motorbikes. We are always having it drummed into us that they are the most vulnerable, they have no protection. We're not really allowed to overtake a cyclist or a motorbike unless there's sufficient room to do so, and looking further ahead to make sure that we've got enough space to actually pull in without causing the cyclist or the motorbike to have to brake or slow down. I think us, maybe because I am one, but we are well trained. I will never turn around and say that no, we're not trained sufficiently. That is one thing that I will say, we are. And we have to take into consideration motorcyclists, bicycles, pedestrians, everybody, we have to take into consideration.
Thank you. I'd also like to come back. You made some comments earlier on around not being aware of Vision Zero. One of the things that's so important to drive up safety standards is to have an open safety culture where it's discussed all the time. So what do you think the barriers are to that? Why is that not being discussed? Why is sort of safety? I mean, obviously you've said in training it is, but day to day, why do you think safety is maybe not sort of discussed and high up the agenda?
I think it's because once we're trained, and because of the level that we are actually trained to, that once we're out on the road, it is nobody's concern but the bus driver. We get blamed for absolutely everything. So we are extra, not only from our training, but we are extra precautious of what we actually do. You know, we're trained to look at the mirrors 3 times when we pull out from a stop. We're trained to check your inside when going round a corner. I think where Vision Zero is concerned, higher above feel that they don't need to worry about us because we are trained to do it properly, and we do take safety into consideration. It's our job at the end of the day. And like I said, we don't want to have an accident inside the bus or outside the bus. I mean, the 12 years I've been a bus driver, truthfully speaking, if I'd ever had an accident, I don't think I'd ever drive again, a bus or a car, and I think a lot of my colleagues feel the same. So it's our responsibility, as well as the training that we've been given in order to do our job properly. I can't see Vision Zero reducing down where the bus industry is concerned. Like I said, we don't have a lot of accidents. If they are, most of them aren't ours. But because of the pressure that we're under, somebody has to look at the industry and say, enough is enough. We need to take into consideration the bus drivers. Like I said, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week with a 40-minute break. We're tired. We do get tired. When you're tired, we're human. We do make mistakes. That's nothing to do with the safety issue or our training. That is to do with fatigued. We ask, help us. We are disregarded by absolutely everybody. People that aren't even bus drivers make decisions on our behalf, which are wrong. nobody today. It was really nice to actually be here today and to get the bus driver's point of view across, because there's things that I could tell you that you'd think, God, I never knew that. Because I'm a bus driver, and you guys, apart from John, who was a bus driver back in the day, people need to understand where us bus drivers are coming from. We don't want to have an accident. We pride ourselves in the amount of accidents we have to avoid on a daily basis, because somebody's walked out in front of us, somebody's pulled out of a side turning, somebody's going too fast and they want to get past us. There's been a lot of accidents where a passenger has got off the bus and gone to the front or the back of the bus and gone to cross the road, and the car's come speeding up because they've underestimated the speed. Now, we get blamed for that. It's ridiculous that we should have to take responsibility for what people do. I think that in order to get Vision Zero where the bus industry is concerned, TfL needs to look at us and look at how we work and the way that we work and reduce it down.
That's really helpful, thank you. I'd like to ask John Murphy, I don't know whether you have any views about the safety culture. I think Lorraine's spoken really interestingly about that, but also just in terms of the actions in Vision Zero that relate to buses. There's stuff around fatigue management, there's stuff around bus safety, and there's stuff about the health and well-being of bus drivers. What's your experience of these programmes and that are designed to prevent fatigue mostly, and are they working, and should anything else be done?
For me, I'm reluctant to say the work done so far by TfL around fatigue management has gone very much further forward than when we first started. I think there's an overall failing to recognise that you can't solve everything by putting a machine into a bus. Some of the measures TfL have taken in between the Loughborough report and up to this point include things like CNI machines where you can see if a driver's fatigued. The problem with that is it's reactive. We need to get to a stage where we're being proactive. So the flaw with the TfL thinking certainly from the union's perception, I'm sure I speak quite accurately and say the drivers will reflect this as well, the people we're representing. The problem with TfL, and it was demonstrated in their recent, they ran a course for all of London while you're talking about training, where people were given virtual reality headsets to put on. And the solution to fatigue from the TfL perspective, according to this training, is don't have an argument with your family at night and make sure you go to bed early. And it completely ignores the fact that we make drivers work longer. We're about to, or there's TfL have a plan to roll out remote sign-on, which is going to make drivers even more fatigued. So, and again, if you go to remote sign-on, the measures that have been put in place up to now, training managers to recognise people who are fatigued, well, how does that work when someone's signing on 5 miles away from the manager? I don't see that working unless they have bionic eyes. So, bionic eyesight, sorry. So I think obviously and I keep banging on about it, and I know a lot of people will think it's that lefty thing again. Funding is an issue because at this moment in time, as we reduce funding as we go forward, this has to have an impact. If you go to the shop with less money, you buy less stuff. I think everyone can accept that. In this instant, if we want to talk about a decent standard of training going forward rather than something that's drawn on the back of a fag packet, then we have to pay for that and we have to invest into that. If we want to talk about putting all these measures in going forward, we have to pay for that. So the funding is critically important. The training itself, how do you train someone not to be tired? So this is the failing in the approach. You have to put measures in place to stop people being tired. And look, if we talk about the training of the standard of bus drivers, well, let me tell you this. In 24 years of bus driving, the vast majority of the people that I have worked with, I have met, have been of the highest standard, who take the job really, really serious. And I think that was never, ever better demonstrated than during the pandemic and the first lockdown. While everyone who could took shelter, bus drivers had to come to work every single day and play Russian roulette. And let that be a symbol of the dedication and the professionalism of these people. As Lorraine says, they're trained to high standards. By and large, when you think of the miles they do, the amount of incidents that they're involved with are quite small in proportion to other road users out there. So it's not necessarily about the training. They can do the job, but sometimes there will be mistakes. And these mistakes are increased when you include things like fatigue and the impacts of the measures that increase fatigue, such as remote sign-on, such as longer duties, such as lower pay, such as. So it's a broader picture than just training. But if you're asking me, is a training around Vision Zero up to scratch? Absolutely not. And who's responsible ultimately for this is the bus operators, the people who operate the contracts from TfL, run the buses in London. The reason it's perhaps not as high on their agenda is because perhaps it's not seen as something that's high on the agenda because there's other things that take priority, like banging out miles, chasing miles, making sure that they maximise the margins that are available to them. So it falls lower down the scale. Money always rules, doesn't it? I hope that's answered what you said, Caroline. Ellie, otherwise I've just talked for like 10 minutes for no good reason.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. Back to you, Chair. Cheers.
That was lovely. Thank you, John. Assemblymember Rogers, and then we're going to move on to looking at e-scooters. Assemblymember Garrett.
Thank you, Chair. I actually had a number of follow-up questions around driver fatigue for Lorraine and John. I think some of them have been answered, but there are a few things if it's okay. So, Lorraine, you mentioned fatigue a number of times. How many times would you say, how often, when there is an incident involving a bus driver, how often is fatigue a contributing factor to that incident?
We don't have any stats on that because fatigue isn't recognised.
And when you say it's not recognised, what do you mean?
Like John said, you can't train a driver not to be tired. However, when you when you finished your duty and you go home, you've got a family that you're involved with. If you're a single parent, you've got the children to get sorted out, you've got shopping to do, you've got cooking to do. You end up with 5 hours sleep. None of that is taken into consideration. All we get told is get plenty of sleep. How can you get plenty of sleep when there's other things that you need to do? We need to reduce down the working hours, but give us a decent pay to cover the reduced hours that we're doing. They're talking about remote sign-on. And they're saying that remote sign-on can reduce down fatigue. How does that work out? I take the first bus out the garage in the morning at 4 o'clock. I have to drive my car to the depot. But when I finish driving and I have to then make my way back to the garage, because that's where my car is, this remote sign-on, we're not going to get paid for that. That's 7% deduction in our wages per year, but we're still basically working for the company because we've still got to make our way back to the garage. And we're fighting that. And nobody seems to be able to understand that fatigue is a big part of our life. We do get tired. We do get very, very tired. And fatigue, what I try to explain, because I'm quite a union activist, what I try to explain to people is fatigue is different from being tired. Fatigue, when you're tired, you can get a little nap. But when you're fatigued, it goes on, and it builds itself up to, you get things like headaches, double vision, you get backache, and I've done it. I've been so tired where I've approached a bus stop and I thought people was at the bus stop, and it wasn't. It was a poster with people on the poster.
So can you give examples of what systems, processes are in place to manage the kind of fatigue that you're talking about? For example, you must have minimum rest periods between shifts and things like that. And are those rest periods adequate, for example?
Right, we have 40 minutes. So if you're driving for 10 and a half hours, in between at some point in that, you can't drive for more than 5.5 hours. That is the European, I think it is the European directive. But when you get 40 minutes, and in that 40 minutes, you have to make your way from getting off that bus to get into a restroom or back to the not back to the garage, but to a restroom, wash your hands, go to toilet, go and get something to eat, or eat what you've brought with you. As you turn around, your 40 minutes is done. You have to get back You have to go to the toilet before you get back on the bus, because if you're going to be driving for another 5.5 hours, there's no facilities unless there's a garage on your route and you can stop, explain to your passengers, run in, use the facilities. It's all of those things that contribute to the fatigue, and to the only way I feel and my colleagues feel is reduce down the hours. But we can't take less hours. A lot of the colleagues actually work rest days. So when you work a 7 days straight, then you have 2 days rest days. You don't. Our colleagues will work that 1 day. So they do 8 hours straight, 1 day off. The shift pattern then changes from working late at night to working first thing in the morning. The whole contribution needs to be looked at. And
another question. Is there is there like a maximum distance you're permitted to live from your depot?
No.
So you could do a shift, say 12-hour shift, whatever. You could have an hour and a half commute back home, and then fit in your life, sleep, and then another hour and a half commute back the following day.
Yes.
And when you finished your shift, is there a minimum period of time that you have to have off before you sign on for duty again?
10.5 hours.
10.5 hours. Okay.
But that is 10.5 hours from when you sign off. So if you spend 3 hours getting it, 1.5 hours getting into work, 1.5 hours getting home, then that's 3 hours out of the 10 hours, which makes it 7 hours. In that 7 hours, you have things to do.
Yes.
We're meant to sleep for 7 hours. They say get enough sleep. It's impossible.
So I'm conscious of time, so my final question on this. If you were to wake up and you're due to go in for a shift, but you felt so fatigued you thought you were unable to do that, would that be accepted if you rang up and said to your manager, I'm too fatigued, I can't come in?
They can't turn around and say, well, you've got to come in, but if you do it more than X amount of times, you will be disciplined and you will have no support. So it will be used against you. So we struggle to come in because we don't want it on our record, we don't want to lose our job, and we don't want to be disciplined. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
No, very useful, and we'll be picking that up in the new year. Let's look at e-scooters, Assembly Member Garrett, and then members, we're going to have to pick up some pace on the last few sections.
Hello, e-scooters. I'm conscious you've been very quiet over there. I suppose the big question is about not just about Lime, but generally we've got three companies doing these trials across London. What's your sort of general 10,000-foot assessment of how those trials overall are going? I think June they're due to expire, aren't they?
Yeah, so obviously from my perspective I can speak on behalf of Lime. It's hard for me to speak on behalf of the other companies or obviously TfL. But in terms of, from my perspective and from the perspective of the latest published stats from the trial, it's going very well. It's been very successful. So we have something, now we now have 10 boroughs involved across London. And I think at the last published figures, which were for last month, cumulatively just under 500,000 trips, which has been, which is a good take-up. And in terms of looking towards Vision Zero and in terms of the safety impact of those journeys, we've seen a very low level of safety incidents. So across those just under 500,000 trips, I think.
Sorry, was that 500,000 Lime trips? Or
Sorry, 500,000 across the whole trial.
Three.
So
Okay.
yeah, so Limes would have been something around about 180,000 of those. And those figures were about a month out of date, so there's a slight lag with that. And across the 180,000 journeys that we've provided on e-scooters, we've had one serious incident that's resulted in hospitalisation and follow-up after that. Aside from that, the number of injuries, the number of incidents, the number of interactions with other road users, with pedestrians, has been very low. So from that perspective, we're pleased with how it's gone, particularly as this is a brand new transport mode being introduced into London. And actually, one of the things we are pleased with the evidence that's being shown is the difference between the type of scheme we're providing and the type of scheme the other operators are providing with legalised, regulated e-scooters and the much less safe illegal e-scooters that we see lots of around London. And that distinction is becoming ever more clear as the trial goes on.
In fact, that was going to be one of my follow-up questions. You've sort of teed it up. So in terms of the distinction between the trials and the sort of private e-scooters, I'm conscious you've got a sort of business interest in saying legalise your lot and ban the other lot, but notwithstanding that obvious sort of slight bias that you have, I mean, where do you think, in terms, let's say we get to June and the government's thinking about what to do next, and obviously it's got options of just keep them all banned, legalise the schemes in a similar format to now, or just legalise all of them, including private. What would you think? How do you evaluate those alternatives?
Sort of irrelevant of the kind of business position from our interest in it, we're actually in favour across the board of legalising e-scooters in the UK. The UK remains one of the outlier countries across the world where e-scooters remain entirely illegal outside of the legalised trials. But what we do want to see is the same standards implemented for privately owned e-scooters as we currently have in place on the e-scooter trials. And mainly that's around vehicle construction, and mainly it's around the safety features the vehicles have to have. So, for example, our vehicles in London have a capped top speed of 12.5 miles per hour. So some of the conversation earlier about automatic speed limits across London, but also in specific areas, they're already implemented on e-scooters. And e-scooters are the only form of transport at the moment where they're widely implemented as a matter of course. So we'd like to see new privately owned e-scooters have similar capped top speeds. In addition to that, the e-scooters in the trial at the moment that we put out have safety features like 2 independent brakes, they're stability tested. Our e-scooters from the top speed in London to stopping have a stopping distance of around 3 metres, and that's tested and the evidence is examined by Department for Transport before we're approved to put that e-scooter onto the roads. So we want to see those standards met by anyone who sells a private e-scooter or anyone who owns a private e-scooter. But more broadly, we think in general, more people using e-scooters. We also offer e-bikes in London, so more people using e-bikes as well, more people cycling and walking will help London meet its climate goals, will help improve air quality, and also help improve safety, because we know that motor vehicles remain the biggest danger on the road. And in addition to that, there's also a benefit in the more people we get using e-scooters, e-bikes, cycles in cycle lanes on the roads. If those people then go off and drive as well, which many people do, I do that, lots of people do it, a greater their understanding is going to be of what it's like to be a vulnerable user of the road, even of a cyclist or an e-scooter user. And there's a real benefit in that in terms of moving towards Vision Zero.
Okay. You mentioned the people using e-scooters. That was something else I was interested in terms of the kinds of people who are renting them, because there's sort of a demographic profile of people who tend to cycle, for example, which is not quite the same as the demographic profile of the whole of London. Do you see since you're running bikes and scooters, do you see a difference between the kinds of people who are renting scooters versus bikes?
There is a slight difference, and globally we do see a difference, and in Europe we see a marked difference in terms of. Generally speaking, there's lots of people who can ride an e-scooter who would never get on a bike. So actually, one of the reasons we've worked quite closely with LCC, but other cycling organisations around the world, one of the reasons they're quite often quite open to working with e-scooter companies to work together on things like segregated infrastructure is because they recognise there's lots of people who just won't get on a bike or an e-bike, and so getting that person out of a car onto an e-scooter, or at least giving that person the chance to experience what it's like to travel around a city not in a car, is really, or in public transport, is really beneficial to improve people's experiences of it. In the UK, the reason why the data is slightly skewed on this is actually because you need a provisional or full driving licence to ride an e-scooter in one of the trials. At the moment, in some parts of London, that requirement is quite exclusionary. So we know that there are certain groups in certain parts of the community who are much less likely to have a provisional driving licence. For one thing, it's expensive to get a provisional driving licence if you don't have one already. And in addition to that, we know that lots of younger people simply don't have provisional driving licences because they've no intention of driving. So actually, that's one thing that we would like to see looked at in the future in order to work out how we can access a wider portion of the community and give more people the opportunity.
When you say look at, you mean abolish that requirement? Is that what that's code for?
Yeah. So I think when the government starts to, in the government's phrases, they're currently looking at this. So when the government looks at what they might do in future, when they choose what future legislation might include, or indeed if they choose not to make e-scooters illegal at all, we would like to see the requirement for a driving licence to be removed because we think that the impact, well, we think that it brings a limited safety benefit for a vehicle like an e-scooter, but the equality impact and the impact in terms of excluding large parts of society from using e-scooters is very large, and it's something that we certainly want to see changed.
So in general, it's broader groups of people who are using e-scooters who aren't using bikes.
Yes, certainly. And actually, there's good evidence from certain different places around Europe, notably some of the Nordic countries, but also places like Germany, that actually things like the gender balance of e-scooter riders is slightly more equal than, for example, it might be on bikes or e-bikes.
No, I was just going to say, I wonder whether, that would be fascinating to me, but I wonder whether you could just send that in, if you've got evidence on that. I think that
certainly,
would be useful.
we can share some stuff on it. I can certainly share some.
The other question I had in terms of how the e-scooters are used is the sort of distance that people are travelling, and whether you have any information about, I realise it's quite hard to know, but what were the modes of transport that those people might otherwise have been using? Either just your intuition, or I don't know whether it's very easy to actually gather that information.
So it's one of the things that the trial is looking at the moment. So TfL is doing some research into this. We are working with some research partners, including we have a trial up in Greater Manchester where we're working with the University of Salford to look at this. And actually the Department for Transport, I think, is due to publish some evidence on that pretty soon. So I think that'll be the best evidence because that'll give you a national picture of it. In London, the average journey time for someone using an e-scooter across the trial is around 20 to 21 minutes. So that implies, roughly speaking, journey length of perhaps 1.5 miles, 2 miles, something like that would be about right. I think the evidence that, and incidentally, that actually tallies pretty closely with the data from our e-bikes in London. So journey length's not massively different, although e-bikes tend to sometimes make much longer journeys. So you very rarely see someone on an e-scooter take it 40 or 50 minutes, whereas actually you quite often see that on an e-bike. So it depends slightly how you take the data. But in terms of where the trips are coming from, it'll certainly be a mix. It'll be a mix of different modes. I think the one area where we do see lots of people using it, and where we can see this from where the e-scooters are being left. So we have parking bays for e-scooters, and the parking bays that get busy quickest are always the ones which are closest to public transport, normally closest to a tube station. And that implies to us, certainly, that actually there is a high turnover of people who are using e-scooters to connect into particularly the tube. Where I live in South East London, no underground, quite a walk from where I am.
With that problem, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Quite a walk to the train station, as I'm sure people will be aware. So for me, there's not an e-scooter bay close enough to me currently to ride an e-scooter to the station. I often use an e-bike for that. But if there was, certainly an e-scooter would be perfect because of a journey of 1 mile, I can leave the e-scooter there. I know it'll be there when I come back. I can link my journey into public transport in that way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Are you also seeing sort of journeys between places that aren't? So, for example, someone here thinks, I might go to Leicester Square, for example. Those kind of journeys, a couple of miles across London as well, or is it really heavily dominated by sort of public transport hubs?
No. So certainly it's a mix, and we are seeing the types of journeys you're talking about. I think the key thing, and it's something that we want to try and do more of in future, the key thing about the e-scooters is they often fill a role for people who want to make a quick journey of not that far, but who perhaps haven't planned before they were going to make that journey, or certainly haven't planned how they were going to make that journey. And a good example of that is, someone leaving, less so now that we're working from home again, but someone leaving an office to go to a meeting a couple of miles away, student going to meet someone from a university, or going to university for a class, making that journey of 1.5 miles, and leaving their sort of departure place and thinking, how am I going to do this? Well, am I going to use? I haven't got a car with me. Am I going to use a taxi or a private hire vehicle? Or am I going to wait for the bus? Am I going to walk it? And actually, that's where something like an e-scooter or an e-bike can really come into the mix, because it's an easy way to make that short journey. From the city perspective, obviously that's a beneficial thing for somebody making, because it means they're going to make that journey in a low emission or zero emission way. So that's the type of journeys we want to see more of. That relies, though, on there being lots of parking areas and lots of areas for people to park e-scooters in afterwards. And so that's one of the things we're working very closely with TfL and the boroughs on for kind of next year.
And have you had, I was just moving on from practical stuff to safety stuff, but just on that point about parking zones, I know there's sort of the GPS sort of geofencing where you have to leave them in a certain area. Is that working in practice as well as it's meant to in theory?
It is working in practice, and it's certainly London is one of the best examples internationally of a parking system for e-scooters and e-scooter rental schemes that's working really well. The parking compliance is well in excess of 95% for Lime, and I believe that across all operators. Again, I can't speak on their behalf, but I think that's the case from what I see. The downside of it, or the challenge for the operator of the e-scooter trial, is that by having parking zones that are defined and where you have to leave an e-scooter and you have to pick one up from, you do reduce the usability of the scheme. It's impossible not to, unless you're able to do what some cities like Paris have done, which is to literally implement thousands of parking areas for bikes, e-bikes and e-scooters. And in that way, you make it really convenient for people to use an e-scooter and to make it really viable. There are parts of London at the moment where even if you're in a borough that's part of the trial and you want to use an e-scooter, you'd open one of the 3 companies' apps performing it, and you'd still have to walk nearly a mile to a parking area. That isn't really a viable option at that point. At that point, you discount e-scooters from your travel options. Yeah, so it's one of the things we do want to work on.
And that presumably it's the boroughs that are allocating those spaces by and large, is it?
Absolutely, and we're completely aware of the competing priorities for space. So it's a really big challenge for the boroughs. It's a big challenge for TfL. We also work with private landowners, and it's a challenge for them. So this is right across the board. But in terms of getting high take-up of these types of transport modes, it's something that we really do need to get right and want to increase. So it's something that we're putting a lot of time and effort into.
Yeah, so reducing that dead time in the journey where you're walking to start it. So in terms of safety, obviously this is the big sort of counterpoint that always comes up with e-scooters. We've heard a bit about it earlier. I know, the question I have down here is what safety measures do you think are needed to roll out e-scooters London-wide? And I think for me there's a particular emphasis on pavement use. I appreciate that the RNIB person isn't here, but if she were here, I'm certain that she'd be saying that blind people find them terrifying on pavements, and they just need to not be there. So particularly with a focus on that, but broadly as well. What do you think is needed to sort of implement them in a safe way?
So firstly, on people riding e-scooters on pavements, it's obviously something that as a rental operator, when you sign up to our service, you undergo training on the app. And we're also, because you have to use our app to rent the e-scooter, we're also able to push messages to people saying, don't ride on the pavements, it's illegal to ride on the pavements. We have that on the scooter as well. And actually, we also have some technology we're developing at the moment, and lots of other operators are developing other forms of technology to try and deal with that problem as a whole. The other thing that we can do, which is a really important step, and actually this is something that we have a disability advisory board in the UK who we work with, the RNIB are part of it, and it's one of the things that we've worked with them quite a lot on, is the idea of having clear identification numbers on the e-scooters. And that actually means that if a member of the public or a TfL enforcement officer or a member of the police, or in some cases people working with our partner boroughs, see people riding on the pavement, it's very easy to report to us the scooter and the location, and using the GPS tracking the scooter, we can ban that user. And at the moment, we're banning around 100 users a month in London for either pavement riding or deliberately misparking. So we are taking out enforcement action on that. I think it remains a significant problem on the private e-scooter side. And the issue around the private e-scooters is there is literally no enforcement, there is literally no law about it whatsoever, because it's already illegal to be using an illegal e-scooter by definition. And that is a big problem, because at the moment, I think we have around 3,500 rental e-scooters in London through our schemes. And I think nationally, the estimates are there could be as many as 500,000 private e-scooters, which you would imagine certainly a couple 100,000 of those are likely to be in London. That's a huge problem. And that's only going to get worse as the months go on, as more people buy these, as retailers continue to sell them. What we'd like to see is the government taking action to put stringent standards in, and that should include things like every e-scooter has to have a bell on it, and it should include making really clear to people it's illegal to ride them on the pavement. At the moment, the illegal e-scooter use is such an unregulated space that things like pavement riding become just another way in which people are breaking the law, and we do need to take care of that. The way we'd like to do that, as I said before, is really about minimum standards for the vehicle themselves. So things like brakes, lights, testing, maintenance, and then asking people to enforce that. Although I think it is also important to say, particularly given the discussions we've had here today, you can never fully eliminate personal responsibility on this. So we can tell people, we can ban people if they use the scooters incorrectly, we can put stickers on the scooters, the police can enforce on it. If people still don't understand or don't want to understand, that's still going to be a problem. And I would say that's something, that goes right across transport modes. It's the same reason why people still drink drive occasionally in the UK. It's personal responsibility and it's unacceptable. Yeah. And that's what we need to communicate.
So on the private e-scooters, it's effectively a sort of legalise and regulate approach is what I'm hearing from
yeah,
sorry, I'm conscious of time.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And
okay.
I won't go into more detail, but certainly legalise, regulate, make the rules very clear, and actually it would be welcomed to regulate, I think, at the point of sale. I think that makes a huge amount of sense. Yeah. We haven't done that thus far, and I think that's a significant problem. Okay, I think if I can pass just quickly over to Jeremy and Tom, and I think I saw Neil indicating as well, and perhaps
very short on time,
yeah,
so just perhaps go to one of the other guests, please. I've got members queuing to come in on this.
Okay, so perhaps to Tom then. As a sort of cycling group, what's the sort of perception of e-scooter users? Is it sort of friends and allies, or rivals and challengers, or how do you make sure that sort of cycling and e-scootering, which are fundamentally quite similar, are working well?
We were aware of the advent of scooters, and we conducted some research, in fact, a couple of years ago, which was pretty thorough, and looked at what happened elsewhere. We concluded that obviously they're not active travel, but on the other hand, they can be part of the tools that we use in order to reduce congestion, pollution, and emissions in our cities. And therefore, we thought that, as was just said, in a regulated and legalized way, they could be a useful part of the program. But obviously, if we have more people on scooters and they are not to use pavements, which makes sense, they will wish to use cycle tracks, and therefore we have to account for the volumes. So as we go forward and design for further cycle tracks, we need to consider that the volumes may be higher and we need to allow for them. And yes, on speeds, I absolutely agree. I mean, to have scooters doing far higher speeds than a regular bicycle would be inappropriate in those cycle lanes. I mean, if they want to do that, they can do that on the road with motor cars.
Lovely, thank you very much. Right, members, I'm really in your hands. I've got Assemblymember Baker and Assemblymember Berry indicating wanting to come in on this. So I'm just saying, and then I have got 3 more sections, which I think if people could condense their questions down, that would be great. Unless you need to decide, do you want to do your one at all, or do we need it at the end? So I'm going to let you think about that. Assemblymember Baker.
I have so many questions I want to ask here, but I'm going to try and
follow
condense.
Up in writing.
I think we may have to. I think something I'm really interested in asking, and it would be opening up to everyone, so I think it would be an absolute disaster right now, is what the impact would be for other road users and pedestrians and cyclists of legalising and regulating. I think if I open that up, it's going to be absolute carnage, so maybe we can follow that up in writing. But what I am interested in asking Alan particularly is that the information you seem to be giving us, though obviously only just taking it in, is that it's short journeys. It's not necessarily people replacing car journeys. They are actually sometimes replacing journeys that they would walk. So in terms of our impact on sort of active travel, in terms of impact on the aspects of Vision Zero that are around modal shift, what role are e-scooters really going to play in that? Because I'm not really hearing that. I'm hearing about the safety of the individual trials and not how e-scooters might contribute to a safer city overall.
Yeah, so the average journey length at the moment from the London trials is around 21 minutes. So like I was saying, that kind of implies upwards of 1.5 miles to kind of a 2-mile journey as an average. So there's a significant number of journeys that are happening that are longer than those. And I think anything really in excess of 1 mile, in most cases, is something that most people aren't going to be walking at the moment. Although I think we do need to look into more detail at whether or not the journeys are switching across from cycling or e-cycling. I think that's something we need to look at the evidence on. Certainly at the moment, as a company that offers e-bikes in London and e-scooters, when they're both available on one app next to each other, you can choose which one you take. We see no dent at all in our usership numbers on the e-bikes. by the introduction of e-scooters. So we don't think that's a concern. I think, though, in terms of the wider point, the benefits are that you're giving people a convenient and easy way to make a zero-emission journey. And in some instances, that zero-emission journey might be replaced, if it's a very short journey, could be replacing a walking trip. But in lots of instances, it's going to be replacing something else which is less desirable. I think in addition to that, certainly the longer journey lengths, the linking into public transport. In the example that I gave before, from where I am, I'm just over a mile into a train station. That's the way I would prefer to get around London. I prefer to get to a train station and take public transport. In most instances, that isn't open to me. So my option is to get a minicab. It's to get a black taxi. It's to walk down the road. It's about 10 minutes to the bus stop and then wait for the bus there. So there is a role here that these scooters can be played. And actually, one of the things that's good about the model in London, with the parking zones in particular, is we can actually site these parking zones in areas where we encourage certain types of journeys and perhaps discourage other ones. So it is early days in the trial. I think we want to see more evidence from London specifically about the modal shift, but those are just some of the ways in which I think we would certainly see the benefits.
But you're keen to expand to people who don't have driving licences, which would indicate that you think the growth area is people who don't have cars?
I think at the moment, the concern about driving licences is one of wanting to be able to serve the largest number of people. It's also one of equality. I think there are people who can't get driving licences for a variety of reasons, who might be able to use an e-scooter, and that's either their own e-scooter privately, perhaps in the future if that becomes legalised, or shared. But in addition to that, from our perspective, we think it's wrong to assume that the only people who are using cars in London are those who own them. I think particularly in central London, particularly in zones 1 and 2, there's a high number of people still travelling in other forms of motor vehicles. So I mentioned minicabs, black cabs, etc. before, personalised forms of motor travel. Those are journeys which we would like to try and actively target people to replace using an e-scooter. And I think that's one of the reasons why we want to see that driving licence requirement ultimately removed eventually.
Lovely, thank you. Assembly-member Berry.
Just a very quick...
No. Assembly-member Berry, I'm really conscious of time, so it's already 12:30.
Thank you very much. Just a really good question, Assembly-member Baker, there. I think, there's a lot of focus on taking very big motorised vehicles that by and large carry one person around and adding electric motors to those, when actually potentially extending the range of very light and small modes by adding tiny electric motors is an aspect we don't look at often enough.
Your question.
However, sorry, I'm aware I've had very little time in this meeting, whereas the Conservative group has had a very long amount of time.
I'm not getting into party politics on this.
Just wanted to make sure that the investigation heard that point.
Yeah.
Now, my question is just about statistics, basically. At the moment, the dashboard that we talked about earlier on, the report on Vision Zero, doesn't report on the safety of e-scooters at all in individual ways. They're under other vehicles, but it's not clear how many of them there are. What do you do? This is obviously DFT who set these categories, and also largely the Department of Transport that do the surveys that determine distance travelled by each mode as well. What are you doing to argue for a separate category, and do you have any idea about the timing of that if you work on lobbying at a national level?
Yes, I don't have any more information at the moment on the timing. Certainly, we would like to see the government act with haste on this, because I think the problem of illegal e-scooters is growing, and the longer we leave it, the worse that will get. In terms of a separate vehicle category, certainly we think e-scooters should be regulated as a separate vehicle category. At the moment, they're regulated as a motor vehicle. It's the same as a car, effectively.
Not in the safety statistics. They're not reported alongside cars. They go in other vehicles.
Yes, so I think that's probably because the safety statistics haven't been updated to look at e-scooters under the legalised trial. There are some bits of research out there that do look at e-scooters specifically. So there's a PACTS report that recently looked at e-scooters specifically. But there is a problem across lots of different organisations, DFT, police, NHS, that actually e-scooter incidents often aren't recorded because it's still a form of transport that in most areas is still illegal. The trials run in about 20, 25 UK cities. Everywhere else, e-scooters are illegal. So it's hard, I think, in terms of recording those for places to do those. We would certainly welcome those incidents being recorded, and in particular, at the moment, a distinction between illegal e-scooters and rental e-scooters. And one of the issues that the PACT report I just mentioned, we can put you in touch with, looked at and actually said was they asked people, were you on a rental e-scooter or on a private e-scooter? And so it's interesting the data from that. Of course, one of the things they also identified is because private e-scooters are illegal, lots of people might be saying, I was on a rental e-scooter, when perhaps that wasn't quite the case.
Okay.
But yes, certainly we would welcome better information and better data. Internationally, there is some better data on it, yeah.
Yeah, it's more about the statistics, though, that you'll not get a statistic that distinguishes between legal and illegal. That's for separate research. But you can't tell me about when it might appear in the statistics. We can ask the Met and the TfL about that.
Yeah, that'd be, certainly, I don't.
I think it's an important point. We need to pick that up. So we're making a note of that. Assembly Member McCartney, looking at international comparisons.
And perhaps if I could start with Tom, if I may, looking at international comparisons, and we've talked about Sweden in particular before, but there's also, I'm aware, Oslo and Helsinki. They've introduced initiatives along the lines of Vision Zero, and I'm just wondering what aspects of them do you think have worked, and what can London learn from them, and then following that up, what would London need to do to actually put in practice some of what they've done?
They've introduced some of the things that we've already talked about. So they have made the effort to reduce motor traffic in general. They have produced infrastructure that is suitable for cycling and walking. They've introduced speed humps. They've introduced speed enforcement. They've introduced home zones. All of those things which we have in their nascent form are there in a much more developed form. And yes, these are smaller cities, but we have seen that Oslo did achieve Vision Zero, meaning 0 fatalities in 2019. I think it went up to 4 the year after, but that is the trend. And they used to have fatalities of the rate at the rate of about 45, if I remember rightly, which is, not that far off. Well, it's half of what we have here, and it's a much, much smaller city, about 650,000. So that's exactly what we need to be doing. We also worth looking at what happens in Holland, and I keep citing Holland, but Holland has a fatality rate for cyclists, which is half that of what we have in the UK. So they have very many more cyclists, but per mile, the rate is much lower. And they do have the whole program of infrastructure and good training and all of the things that we've discussed previously. One of the other things that they are struggling with, and we will be struggling with, is parking and leaving things. And as with these scooters, we need places to put these vehicles, and we need them not to obstruct others. And we concluded from our Climate Safe Streets report that we needed something shared every 300 metres or so. I was talking about 1 mile for an e-scooter. Well, that's too long. Whether it's a pedal cycle that you're hiring, or a car, or a e-scooter, or any other mode of shared transport, these need to be frequent, because the whole idea is to try and reduce the need for cars. We need to make the other options attractive and easily available.
Thank you. Can I ask the same question to Jeremy, please?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think Tom's covered a lot of the points. I think it was really good point he made about. I mean, I think a lot of it has been they were prepared to grasp some politically difficult issues, and obviously they are completely different in size compared with London. But I think the two key elements would be this issue of traffic volumes and reducing traffic going into and through the centres, and also prepared to address parking levels. I think that's really, really important, and obviously those are knotty things to grasp. And I think the other relevant thing for London is just, in our situation, is just the role of the boroughs. And boroughs have led on a lot of things like 20 mile an hour, but also it's really important as an analogy that the boroughs take part in the rest of the scheme, all of these things to make Vision Zero work, and that they're able to be funded to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It seems to me, just looking at the Sweden example, for example, it wasn't just the Transport Authority doing this, it was through all levels of government, and there was real will to actually do it, and it became, if you like, a society's issue as well. It wasn't just institutional issue, it's for everybody to take hold of. So my follow-up really is, what does London need to do to get to that stage where it's acceptable and we don't really have the arguments between different road users? And is it possible to get there?
So I'll just quickly jump in there. I think that's a really good point, and I think there was real analogies to what happened in New York as well. And in New York, they actually embedded Vision Zero in the mayor's team, so it was very much, it was absolutely embedded in the culture at the high level. And I think that idea of bringing things together is a terribly good one. And obviously there are opportunities to go further there and tie into those other agendas we touched on early on: healthy streets, air quality, climate emergency, cutting emissions.
I would add that the Mayor's transport strategy talks about I think it's 70% of us should have access to the strategic cycle network within 400 metres. And if we manage to achieve that, then all those people who wish to cycle will be able to take the opportunity to do so, and those who are driving will have less congestion. And someone recently put together a video which I'll be happy to share from Holland, where they said that Holland is the best place to drive, and the video was all about how Holland is ideal for driving because there are so many people cycling, because there are facilities for cycling and walking. So there's the other benefit. There's a benefit that goes across society as a whole.
And if anybody else wanted to comment on international comparisons. No, thank you, Chair.
Lovely, thank you very much. Assemblymember Rogers is going to ask a couple of questions and then we'll draw it to a close.
Thank you, Chair. No, I think I've been able to sort of boil this down to two questions. I'll address them both to Jeremy, if that's okay. So firstly, do you think behaviours on the road have to change across the entire country in order for our city to be successful in achieving these goals?
Thank you for that. Yes, I mean, I think London has almost had to lead the way, in the last decade or so, and I think it has been that and a number of cities, have been filling a void where there's not been an adequate focus on reducing casualties, and in fact that hasn't happened across the UK. I think what's exciting, potentially post-pandemic, is the way this is now working on a sort of a whole UK-wide basis, and I think that things are starting to change, which obviously could benefit London as well. And the two examples I would give, and I won't go into detail, I promise, is the new elements in the highway code which emphasise the road user hierarchy, and putting the reducing harm to the most vulnerable at the top. I think that's really exciting if that gets promoted and publicised properly. And we've touched on this in some detail, the potential for intelligent speed adaptation to reduce danger. So I do think, and I do think, the building back better agenda is a sort of, it's to be seen how that happens. But around that context, there's a lot happening whereby government is starting to get your hands dirty in this area again.
Okay, thank you. Another specific, you've mentioned these two, but specific, say, local initiatives elsewhere in the UK that we could learn from, and more generally, should TfL and the Mayor be collaborating more across the UK?
Yes, and I promise I won't go into that. We've got a list of examples from the UK. They're not huge ones. They're more elements such as the Warwickshire Road safety strategy has got improved perception of safety as a KPI. We'll, if we may, we'll do a written submission about. But yeah, there are some examples. But I would say overall, no one's got a strategy that's this holistic, and with the potential that Assemblymember McCartney mentions, the chance to bring these things together, that needs to be done at the highest level. But there's all the ingredients to do that here.
Okay, thank you.
Yes,
Tom, if you want
to just to add, the West Midlands programme of close passing and trying to discourage close passing through enforcement programmes has been quite successful and replicated in some parts of London. That's been very welcome. The other interesting aspect of behaviour in the UK is zebra crossings, where we all stop and we all respect, you know, the pedestrian's right to cross. It would be excellent if that sort of behaviour was wide across the whole sort of aspect of road use.
Thank you. That's my question, Chair.
Thank you very much for brevity there. I realise there's lots we haven't covered today, and we will invite you, obviously, to send in any evidence that you haven't had the opportunity to give us today, and we will also follow up with questions. Unmesh had a question at the end about what are your final thoughts, what needs to happen with Vision Zero. So I think we just need to get that in writing from you so we get the detail, otherwise we're going to rush through it today. So thank you for giving up your question, Assemblymember Desai. So can I thank all of our guests today? It's been really useful, really interesting. John from online, I know it's difficult. Thank you very much for joining us. And all of our other guests, we've got Neil, Lorraine, Tom, Jeremy and Alan. So thank you very much indeed for your time today and for coming in to see us. Members, can we note the report and the discussion and also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the Deputy Chairman and Party Group Lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting?
No, agreed.
Lovely, though clearly that won't be coming until after our January hearing, where we have TfL, the police and others before us. Item 6, can we note the work programme and also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the Deputy Chairman and Party Group Lead members. This is important, to agree the final formal decisions regarding appointments to the London Travel Watch Board, further to the recent recruitment exercise and subject to consultation with the Secretary of State for Transport.
Agreed.
Lovely, thank you very much. Our next meeting is 10 o'clock on the 11th of January 2022 in these rooms at the London Fire Brigade headquarters. I've got no other item of urgent business, so thank you so much. Sorry we've had to rush the end of it, and have a good Christmas and New Year. Thank you very much.